You wake to the sound of a wooden latch lifting, soft in the dim half-light of dawn. Outside, the air is cool enough that your breath clouds faintly, drifting past the edge of the small doorway. Somewhere down the lane, you hear the muted thump of millstones turning, a steady rhythm that has worked its way into the village's mornings for as long as anyone remembers. The scent follows soon after, warm, nutty, heavy with the tang of freshly ground rye. It clings to the mist, mixing with the faint sweetness of damp hay and the sharper note of wood smoke curling from a few waking chimneys. You walk toward the mill yard, the packed earth underfoot still holding the dampness of last night's dew. The yard is quiet apart from the low groan of the water-driven gears inside and the occasional scrape of a wooden scoop as grain is shifted from sack to hopper. The miller, stooped and broad, works without looking up. You've seen him do this in summer's bright mornings, and in the dim gray of winter, it makes little difference to the turning of the stones. Today, rye is the grain of choice, the same dark, sturdy seed that feeds much of the village. You know it keeps well in cool, dry storage, though not forever. Historians still argue whether most medieval millers could recognize when a batch had turned dangerous, whether from damp or from the pale fuzz of mold that might hide deeper troubles. Some say the signs were clear enough. Others think people simply learned to live with the risk. The smell here is layered. The raw, green scent of whole grain in sacks, the warm bread, like aroma of flour pouring into bins, and a faint bitterness rising from the dust itself. Dust hangs in the beams of light, slanting through the open shutters, drifting down onto the floorboards in lazy spirals. It clings to the folds of your sleeves and settles on your skin, so fine you barely feel it. You stand still, letting the hum of the stones and the steady drip of the water wheel outside form a slow, even pulse in the air. A cat slips past your ankles, its fur powdered with flour, tail brushing your leg like a soft broom. The miller's wife leaves a basket on a low stool, a simple loaf wrapped in cloth, still faintly warm. She says nothing, and you say nothing back. The morning here doesn't ask for conversation, only the quiet work of turning grain into something that will last a few days more. The day will go on like this, and the bread will taste as it always does, unless, of course, something hidden in the rye decides otherwise. You step away from the mill yard, following the scent of baking that drifts from a nearby cottage. The air is still cool enough to see your breath, but inside the small, low room it is warm in a way that sinks into your bones. A wide hearth dominates the far wall, its fire glowing steadily behind a curtain of smoke-stained iron tools. Beside it, on a thick wooden board, rest several round loaves, each one swelling slowly, the dough rising as though it has learned the rhythm of breathing. You watch as the baker, a wiry man with forearms dusted white, leans in close to the heat. He checks the loaves, not with a clock, there is no such thing here, but by the way their crusts begin to split along their scored tops. The cracks are small now, just hairline seams, but soon they will open wider, revealing the pale crumb within, before sealing over into deep golden ridges. The smell of them is rich and heavy, a mixture of toasted grain, yeast, and the faint sweetness of the wood smoke curling from the hearth. You notice, as you often do, that some loaves are darker than others. Rye tends to bake into a deep brown, its crust nearly as hard as the peel used to pull it from the oven. Barley breads stay paler, but feel heavier in the hand. Historians still argue whether the people of small villages had much choice in flour mixtures, or if most simply baked with whatever grain survived storage best. It is said that finer white bread was rare here save for feast days, or the tables of those who could afford more than survival. The baker works quietly, moving from the hearth to a table where fresh dough waits in neat rounds beneath a damp cloth. He dusts them with a little coarse flour before moving them closer to the heat. You can feel it from where you stand, the fire's warmth wrapped around your legs, the dry air pricking your skin. A pot of something savory simmers on the edge of the hearth, scenting the room with onions and herbs. The loaves beside the fire pop faintly as they expand, a soft ticking sound that blends with the low roar of the coals. The baker doesn't watch them constantly. His hands are busy kneading another lump of dough, fingers pressing deep into its soft weight, folding it over and over until it springs back. You notice that his knuckles are lined and reddened, the skin roughened from years of flour and heat. Behind you, a small window lets in the morning light, dust motes drifting slowly in its path. You stand still, letting the smell wrap around you like a blanket. And think about how each day in this village begins with bread, whether it is light and soft, dense and dark, or, on rare and unlucky days, touched with something that turns dreams into strange visions. But for now, here in the warmth, it is only the smell of safety and hunger met. You leave the warmth of the hearth and step into the open air. The sky now a pale wash of blue with thin wisps of cloud trailing overhead. Along the lane, a cart has stopped in front of a low stone building. Two men lift heavy sacks down from its bed, the coarse cloth bulging and shifting under their arms. You walk closer, feeling the faint thump as each sack lands against the ground. The grain inside is a mix of barley and rye, the dull gold of the barley kernels glinting when a seam in the cloth loosens just enough to spill a few. You know these sacks have traveled from the fields beyond the village, where the last harvest left stubble in the soil and scarecrows still stand, weathered and bent. Some sacks are heavier than others, packed so tight they seem to resist the curve of the carrier's back. Each is marked with a simple symbol burned into the cloth, an ear of grain, a circle, a cross meant to remind the miller or the baker where it came from and what it holds. The men stack them in a neat row against the wall, the scent of the grain rising even through the cloth. There is a faint sweetness to it, the smell of late summer still clinging to the kernels. If you press your hand against the sack, you feel the slight shifting inside as the grain settles. Historians still argue whether villagers truly understood the danger of grain stored too damp or too long, especially rye. Some believe that people noticed odd effects but could not guess their cause. Others think the link between bread and strange visions was known well enough to be whispered over mugs of ale. One of the men unties a sack's mouth and tips it, letting a cascade of grain spill into a waiting trough. The sound is like dry rain, steady and soft, filling the air with the dust of the harvest. The kernels bounce and slide over each other, catching the morning light. You notice the darker flecks among them, not dirt exactly, but something else, shriveled seeds that the baker will later try to sift out. A woman with a woven basket approaches, her skirt brushing against the packed earth. She watches for a moment, then takes a small scoop of grain for herself, paying with a folded strip of cloth dyed a muted green. The transaction is silent, as if such exchanges happen so often that words would only slow them. The cart, now empty, creaks as it rolls away, leaving faint wheel tracks in the lane. The stacked sacks lean slightly against each other, like resting figures. You stand there, watching a thin swirl of dust settle in the cool air, knowing that these sacks will soon find their way to the millstones and, eventually, the ovens. And when they do, the village will taste the season, sometimes as it should be, sometimes not at all as expected. You lift the small round stone from its resting place, surprised as you always are by how solid it feels for such a modest circle. The hand mill waits on a low bench, 2 stones, upper and lower, their faces smoothed by years of turning. The lower stone is fixed, as patient as a seated elder. The upper stone holds its wooden handle like a curled arm at the rim. You pour a measured handful of grain into the shallow eye at the center, the kernels clicking softly as they settle. When you place your palm on the handle and begin to turn, the sound changes to a dry murmur, stone speaking to stone. The motion wants to be slow, steady, unhurried. Your shoulder follows the circle. Your breath follows your shoulder. The first powdery ring creeps outward between the stones, pale where the barley breaks, deeper brown where the rye gives way. Dust rises and then settles on your knuckles, catching in the tiny cracks in your skin. After a few turns, you feel the rhythm, a simple tide. Lift, pull, circle, release. You wipe your nose with the back of your wrist and leave a faint stripe of flour there, the kind that makes even a careful face look cheerfully careless. You remember that nearly every household keeps a tool like this, even with the mill down by the stream. The great stones are faster for sacks. The small stones are kinder to mornings. There is comfort in the closeness. You see each grain you grind. You hear it change. You decide when to stop. Historians still argue whether most families kept the hand mill as a necessity when the river ran low, or as a habit that refused to die even when larger mills were common. Either way, the quern seems to prefer the slow company of hands. You pause to lift the upper stone and brush the meal into a wooden bowl. It looks wholesome, but you sift with your fingertips anyway, chasing out a few odd bits. A husk that escaped the flail, a hard, withered kernel darker than the rest. Some you flick aside without thinking, others you hold a moment longer, turning them near the light from the door. You know to be cautious with rye. It's a common bread here, especially where the soil is cool and the summers behave more like guests than residents. The saying goes that rye is a friend that sometimes forgets your name. A neighbor once told you a household charm for milling a tiny line, muttered under the breath to keep the stones from biting. You do not put much faith in charms, but you like the feel of the words in your mouth, the oldness of them. The line is nothing grand, just a friendly whisper to the tool that saves your wrists from stubborn kernels. Whether you speak it or not, the stones do what they were made to do, and the powder grows. Quirky as it is, the charm shares space with more practical wisdom. Keep your grain dry. Let the breeze pass over it. Do not trust a sack that smells wrong, no matter how small your hunger is. You tip a second handful into the eye and set the upper stone back, aligning the little wooden peg that keeps it centered. The circle starts again. You notice that the meal emerging now is finer than the first ring. The stones have warmed slightly, and they reward your patience with a gentler texture. Somewhere outside, a rooster tries to sound triumphant and manages only a ragged croak, like a trumpeter learning at dawn. You keep turning. The bowl fills slowly, and with it your thoughts. You think of the great loaves at market, their crusts split wide like old laughter, and of the loaves that never quite settle into themselves. You think of that other talk, the neighbor's bread that made the world ripple at the edges, the shadows that moved when they should have held still. No one calls it a curse. Not exactly. They call it ill bread, or hot bread, or simply blame the oven. Yet you've seen the darker grains that sometimes find their way into the sack. You've heard of harvests when the rain lingered too long and rye behaved like a plant with secrets. Historians still argue whether people recognized the danger by sight alone, or whether they learned from the results. The lesson written not in books but in nights of hard waking dreams. A cat appears at your feet as if summoned by flour. It sneezes once, offended by the dust, then curls at the edge of the bench and pretends the sneezing never happened. You offer it the handle to sniff. It does so with exaggerated seriousness, then decides your shoes are more interesting. The cat's presence feels like a little household blessing, or at least a guarantee that any mouse foolish enough to care for grain will learn better manners. You think not for the first time that mills and cats share a quiet understanding. Both like the same warm corners. Both keep small troubles in check. You wipe the sweat from your forehead with the crook of your arm and test the meal between thumb and forefinger. It is coarse, as the village prefers for everyday loaves, the specks of bran visible like small islands on a pale sea. The taste, when you lift a pinch to your tongue, is earthy and sweet with a shadow of bitterness at the end. You make a face at the bitterness, then make the same face again just to see if it changes. It doesn't, but the second time feels less serious, so you accept it. A thought crosses your mind as you scrape a few stubborn grains from the lower stone. Would hand, milling, slow and personal, make a difference when a harvest went wrong? Some people say the small stones allow more careful sorting, that a watchful pair of hands can pick out more of the trouble than a fast chute ever could. Others say no, if the sack is touched with darkness, the meal will carry its memory no matter how patiently you turn. Historians still argue whether households that used querns fared better in uncertain years, or whether the difference is only a comforting tale. You set the thought aside like a pebble collected on a walk, kept but light. You stand, stretch your back, and pour the meal into a linen-lined basket. A few particles fly up and settle across your eyelashes. A soft veil you blink away. The room smells simple and good, stone, wood, grain, and the slight heat of work. Outside, the lane murmurs with familiar sounds, boots on earth, a cart's wheel complaining, a door eased open to let in light. You cover the basket and rub your palms together over the floor, letting the flour fall away in a faint trickle. Before you put the stones to rest, you make one last circle with the handle, an empty turn that feels like a polite farewell. The upper stone settles with a small sigh against the lower, a sound you've come to trust. You set the quern aside and lift the basket. The meal is not yet bread, but it contains the memory of turning and the promise of heat. It also contains, if you are honest, a thread of uncertainty that runs through every loaf, thin, mostly quiet, but present. You carry both the promise and the uncertainty toward the hearth, moving through air that smells like flour and cat and morning. The cat follows, pretending it is uninterested and failing completely. In the doorway you pause and glance back at the stones. They look like two round eyes set into the bench, watching with the unblinking patience of tools that outlast their owners. You nod to them for no good reason except that nodding feels right. Then you step into the day, the basket warm against your hip, ready to turn meal into dough, and dough into the kind of bread that feeds a calm evening. Unless, of course, the village finds itself in one of those seasons when rye remembers its secrets. The baker's long wooden peel leans against the wall, its smooth handle darkened by years of flour-dusted hands. You watch as he lifts it, moving with the care of someone who knows how easily dough can collapse if treated roughly. The board is wide and flat at the end, enough to hold a round loaf without letting it sag. With one motion, he slides the peel beneath a shaped lump of dough resting on a floured cloth. The loaf shudders slightly as it moves, then stills as if remembering its shape. The oven is a wide, low dome built from stone and clay, its dark mouth glowing faintly from the heat within. You can feel it on your cheeks before you even step close, the dry, enveloping warmth that pushes back against the coolness of the morning. The baker bends his knees slightly, sliding the loaf far inside with a practiced twist of his wrist. The dough leaves the peel cleanly, settling onto the hot stone floor with a muffled sigh. Each loaf takes its place in a neat row against the oven's curve. The baker keeps them close but not touching, so the heat moves evenly around each one. Historians still argue whether medieval bakers preferred communal ovens for the way they conserved fuel, or for the steady, predictable heat that was difficult to achieve in smaller household hearths. Some suggest that the shared baking also served as a quiet form of social gathering, if not for talk, then for the quiet nods and half smiles exchanged over rising dough. When the last loaf is in, he leans the peel against the wall and steps back. The oven's heat makes the air shimmer faintly, the loaves inside already beginning to swell. A few pop with soft cracks along their tops, releasing curls of fragrant steam. You can almost see the outer crust firming, its color deepening by slow degrees from pale cream to gold and finally to brown. The smell is steady, unhurried, and impossible to mistake for anything else. On the table nearby, more dough rests beneath damp linen cloths, each round dusted lightly with flour. You lift the corner of one cloth, and peek underneath. The dough has a faint skin from rising, and small bubbles have formed along its surface. You let the cloth fall back gently, as if returning a blanket to a sleeping figure. The baker notices, but says nothing, his attention returning to the fire. He feeds a small stick into the mouth of the oven, nudging it until it catches at the edges. The flames inside leap briefly, then settle again, the light flickering against the stone. A faint layer of ash has already formed on the floor where the loaves will not touch it. The smell of hot stone mingles with the smell of the bread itself, a combination that can make even the most patient stomach stir. You lean against the wall, letting the heat soak into you. A child appears at the doorway, eyes bright at the sight of the oven's glow. The baker waves him over, hands him a small scrap of dough, and watches as the child clumsily shapes it into something that might one day resemble a loaf. The piece is small enough to bake quickly. Soon it will join the others, a tiny apprentice among the full-sized loaves. Somewhere in the background, a cart rattles past on the lane outside, its wheels clicking over a loose board. The sound fades, leaving only the gentle hush of the oven and the occasional faint pop of crust forming. You know the loaves will be ready in less than an hour, each one carrying the warmth of the fire and the particular taste of this village's grain. Most will be safe and filling, but every now and then, in certain seasons, a loaf will hold more than heat and hunger. It will carry something that hums quietly in the mind, waiting for nightfall. You step into the village grain store at mid-morning, when the sun sits high enough to warm the lintel but not yet high enough to drive off the faint chill that lives among timbers. The door is wide, hung on iron straps that sigh when moved. Inside, the light is thin and slanted, lattice work through the cracks and the small high windows. Dust hangs in those rays like pale thread. Your eyes take a moment to settle. Then the shapes come forward. Long ranks of sacks leaning against one another, soft-shouldered and patient, the way sleeping bodies lean on a hall's wooden wall after a long day. The floor is packed earth, tamped hard and swept by somebody who knows where corners hide crumbs. Boards raise certain platforms a hand's breadth above the ground, and on these rest the sacks that matter most, the newer harvest, the rye with its darker weight, the barley that smells faintly of hay. You tread carefully, souls quiet. A hush belongs here, as if the grain itself listens. The air smells of dry husk, old wood, and the cool breath of stone. Somewhere behind the nearest stack, a mouse changes its mind about running. You hear only the tiny reconsidering. A steward keeps count with a chalk tally on a board beside the door. He nods to you and goes back to his work, untying a cord and peering into a sack's mouth to see how the kernels lie. He closes his eyes for a beat and breathes in, the way bakers do in the morning and millers do at the chute. The sound of his breath says more than words. This one is sound. This one is quiet. This one can wait. You watch him dip a wooden scoop, lift a measure, and let it fall back in a slow, even pour. The rain of grain is comforting. Its music makes time feel orderly. You run your hand along the burlap and feel where damp once brushed it and then fled. The mark is faint now, but your fingers know the story of it. A bad week of rain can make a harvest feel like a guest who has overstayed. In those weeks, people open and reopen sacks, loosen mouths, stir the kernels, spread cloth in the yard, and let the sun do what it can. Historians still argue whether most village stores were built with enough breath vents, gaps, clever chimneys to keep grain dry through long seasons, or whether good luck and constant tending were the true guardians of the food. The store you stand in offers its own answer. A few vents high in the wall, a gap beneath the door, and the steady habit of watchful hands. Along one beam hangs a twist of dried herbs, juniper, a little rosemary, a narrow strip of something you cannot name by scent alone. People say smoke from juniper keeps pests uneasy. Whether it does or merely pleases human noses, you cannot say. The steward lights a small pan of charcoal near the far corner some days and sets a handful of herbs on it. A thin smoke walks the room, slow and clean, and everything seems a little more polite afterward. You smile at the memory of that smell and feel almost the absent smoke scratch the back of your throat. Historians still argue whether such fumigations had any real power beyond ritual, whether insects and molds minded them at all, or whether people simply liked to feel they were not idle in the face of small, creeping troubles. You lean to read the marks on several sacks. Chalk symbols, thread colors at the throat, the shorthand of the store. 1 knot means early cutting, 2, late. A red thread for the strip of field that runs near the stream, a blue thread for the hill that stares at the wind. You untie one mouth and pinch a few kernels. Rye is heavier in the palm, and its smell is stronger, earth darker, as if it remembers last winter's fire better than barley does. You roll a berry between thumb and forefinger until the hull brightens. An old woman once told you to do this with any doubtful grain. Wake it. If it wakes sweet, keep it. If it wakes bitter, let the hens dream with it. Quirky as it sounds, you find yourself obeying her still. A row of wooden bins lines the opposite wall. Here, the store keeps loose grain when a sack's cloth fails. The lids are thick, hinged with leather straps, and weighted with stones to deny easy entry to small teeth. When you lift one lid, a calm hush rises, the sound a heap makes when it settles a little to accept your curiosity. The kernels shine where the light touches them. You move your fingers like a rake, drawing a shallow furrow and watching it fill itself again. Somewhere in that small glitter, a few darker grains glint in the shadow, shriveled, rough, not like the rest. You pick them out and lay them on the lid, small warnings lined like seeds of caution. The steward joins you and tilts his head at the little row. He says nothing, but he sets a shallow bowl nearby for such picking. You both know the longer work will happen later. Sieving, winnowing, lamplight sorting when the day's chores sleep. Historians still argue whether most folk could truly tell by sight which dark fragments spelled trouble and which were merely harmless guests in the harvest. You think of lantern evenings in kitchens, of foreheads bent close to sieves, of fingers tired from mercy and suspicion. Maybe sight is enough. Maybe it never was. You walk the length of the store and back. Your shoulders brush the cool posts, stained by years of leaning and lifting. On one post, someone has carved a little owl, no bigger than a thumb. Its eyes are circles, its beak a shallow notch. Folklore says owls keep watch against rodents even when carved. Folklore also says a sprig of nettle tucked into a sack's throat nettles the hunger out of pests. Quirky rules, yes, but rules that make the work feel tended by more than hands. You reach up and touch the owl's round head as you pass, not in faith exactly, but in fellowship with everyone who ever paused here and asked for quiet nights. At the far end, a door opens to a lean-to where a few sacks rest on a lattice of sticks above the earth. A breeze slips through the slats and grazes the cloth, like a careful hand soothing a restless sleeper. You crouch and look along the underfloor, where scattered straw keeps the ground from turning to paste after hard rain. A small clay dish sits there with ashes in it, someone's trick to confuse the noses of ants. You nod at the hidden neatness, the way the store contains both the public order of tall stacks and the private order of small measures made in corners. You press your ear to a sack as if it might speak. What you hear is only the hush of many small bodies at rest. The quiet offers a slow certainty. This will be bread. This will be porridge. This will carry the village from today into the quiet part of winter. Yet you know how quickly certainties turn when weather and chance decide otherwise. A wet week in harvest can lay a shadow that walks months later into a kitchen and sets its hand on a loaf. And then, after supper, someone stares at a wall and watches it waver like heat above a road. The steward closes a bin with a gentle hand and writes another line on his board. You help him tie 2 throats with clean cord, your fingers moving in the simple grammar of loops and tucks. When you step back toward the door, the light outside looks brighter for having stood in the cool dim. You breathe the store's air once more, grain, wood, a hint of herbal smoke that exists only in memory today. Before you leave, you pause at the threshold and glance back. The sacks lean. The owl watches. The chalk waits for evening counts. There is order here, careful, practiced, imperfect. You think, as you often do, that stores are like songs the village hums to itself. Steady notes repeating, small variations keeping boredom from turning careless. Historians still argue whether such songs were enough, whether the architecture itself, with higher vents or better floors, made the true difference, or whether nothing but fortune decides which loaf settles gently in the stomach and which one sings too loudly in the mind. You step into the courtyard and narrow your eyes against the sudden white of noon. A few grains cling to your palm. You lick your thumb and taste a ghost of sweetness, a dry meadow on the tongue. The door thuds shut behind you, and the store returns to its slow breathing. You carry its quiet with you toward the lane, where heat rises off the earth, and the day, like the bins, will brim and then settle. You follow the sound before you see it, the low, constant groan of a wheel turning in water. The river mill sits just beyond the bend, where the current quickens and wraps itself around a bend of stone. The building is squat, sturdy, and timbered, its base slick with moss where the spray reaches. A faint mist hangs in the air, cool against your skin, and somewhere inside the churn of the wheel a deeper sound pulses, as if the river's own heart has been made to work for bread. The wheel itself is broad and dark, its paddles worn smooth at the edges. Each time it turns, water slaps into the paddles and spills off again in a silver sheet. You stand close enough to feel the drops on your cheeks and the faint grit they leave when they dry. The smell here is part riverweed, part wet wood, and part something sharper, the scent of grain dust escaping from an open window. The air carries both the cool damp of the river and the warm dryness of the milling room. You watch as a miller leans out to adjust the sluice, his hands braced against the slick wooden gate. The rush of water changes, the wheel slowing just slightly before settling into a steadier pace. Historians still argue whether medieval mills like this one were more reliable than windmills, or whether their dependence on seasonal flow made them equally fickle. Some say the river mills offered steadier work in winter. Others note that floods could swallow them without warning. Inside, the sound deepens to a steady, muffled thump as the great stones turn. The miller's apprentice feeds grain into the hopper. the kernels tumbling down a narrow chute to the stones below. The smell is instantly stronger here, filling the room with a heavy, flower-sweet air. Dust swirls in the sunbeams that cut through the high windows, and your eyelashes grow faintly white with it. You rub them gently, leaving the faintest smear on your fingertips. The floorboards tremble with each turn of the wheel outside, the motion rising through your soles and into your knees. You lean against a beam, feeling the rhythm pass into you. Slow and patient, the apprentice works without speaking, tipping small measures into the hopper and pausing to listen to the grind. A good miller, you've heard, can hear when the stones are too close or too far, when the meal will be fine enough, or when it will be fit only for coarse loaves. Near the wall, sacks wait in loose stacks, some open-mouthed and sagging after recent work. You glance inside one, noting the pale, powdery contents and the flecks of bran that catch the light like chaff in wind. Among the clean kernels, you notice a few shriveled ones, dark, twisted, and smaller than their healthy companions. They are easy to overlook, but your fingers pause on them all the same. The miller notices your gaze and shrugs. From the damp patch last summer, he says, and leaves it at that. You nod, unsure if that means the bad grains have been pulled aside, or if they've simply been ground down into the same meal as the rest. Historians still argue whether medieval millers made a habit of separating such grains, or whether the pressure to keep flour flowing overruled caution. In some places, they say, people accepted the occasional strange bread as part of life, no more avoidable than a rainy harvest. The wheel outside keeps turning, steady as breath. You step to the doorway again and watch the river catch light on its ripples. A heron stands in the shallows downstream, motionless except for the tilt of its head. A pair of boys skip stones from the opposite bank, their laughter carrying over the water in quick bursts. The mill ignores them, working as it has for years. The wheel turning, the stones grinding, the flour falling in slow clouds. You stay until the smell of the meal grows almost too thick to bear, and then you step back into the open air. The river's mist cools your face instantly, and you take a deep breath, rinsing your lungs with its damp freshness. Behind you, the mill keeps its steady pulse, a heartbeat that belongs to both water and bread. And somewhere in the deep hum of stone on stone, you think you can almost hear the quiet reminder that not every loaf will carry only the taste of grain. You step into the tavern at the hour when light turns from yellow to a thicker amber, the beams angling through the doorway and laying long rectangles on the floor. The room is cool compared to the lane, its air flavored by malt and smoke and the faint iron tang that clings to old kettles. The alewife looks up from a bench near the hearth and lifts her chin in greeting, then returns to her quiet work with a knife and a round loaf. She cuts the bread into thick wedges, each slice heavy enough to sit with seriousness in the palm, then arranges them in a shallow wooden bowl. The ale sits close by in a lidded pitcher, cool to the touch where the earthenware has not faced the fire. When she pours, the liquid glows a soft brown, cloudy and alive with the leftovers of brewing. You watch as she tips the bowl and lets the ale meet the bread. The first contact makes a sound like breathing through cloth. The crusts drink slowly, then give in, the wedges darkening as they take on the ale's warmth and the faint sweetness of grain, turned twice, once in the field, once in the tun. This is supper as many know it. Bread sopped in ale, softened for teeth tired from the day. It is said sensibly that ale is safer than water, the boil and the fermentation chasing off the worst of what the river and well sometimes offer. That is the calmer truth that sits behind the tavern's open door. Here, people drink what has been carefully made to be kind to their stomachs, even if their heads grow pleasantly fogged at times. Historians still argue about just how fogged, whether everyday ale was mostly mild, small ale, with little strength, or whether some households and taverns kept it robust even for ordinary meals. The answer seems to shift with region, season, and the temperament of whoever was doing the brewing. The alewife slides the bowl your way, sets a spoon beside it, then decides the spoon is unnecessary and lifts it again. You tear the first piece with your fingers. The crust gives a thin crackle, and the crumb pulls in long threads before surrendering. When you lift it to your mouth, it brings the tavern with it: malt, wood, a hint of smoke from the hearth, and a shadow of bitterness that reminds you grains have their own small defenses. The bread went into the oven this morning. The ale was racked yesterday. Together they make a calm supper that asks for little chewing and even less talking. Around you, the room murmurs. A tinker counts nails on the table, sliding them into neat rows, as if the numbers might persuade tomorrow's work to behave. Two laborers bend over a shared bowl, each spoon moving at the same unhurried pace, like friends who have agreed not to out-eat one another. A traveler leans back against the wall and closes his eyes between mouthfuls, smiling at something no one else needs to see. The alewife passes, wipes a table with a cloth wrung out so hard that it makes a dry squeak, and then pauses by the doorway to peer at the sky's color, as if the evening's brewing schedule might be written there. You watch her a while. In many towns, women tend the mash and the yeast. The old word calls them brewsters or alewives, and the village owes much of its thirst peace to their patience. That is the mainstream shape of things, though names change and exceptions keep their own books. Historians still argue how complete that picture is, whether women dominated brewing everywhere, or whether men took over more quickly in some places once brewing shifted from household habit to steady trade. The ledgers left to us are shy about the quiet truth of kitchens and bolder about taxes. The alewife sets a second bowl nearby, this one with sops dressed in a pinch of ground mustard seed and a ribbon of honey. It is a small kindness for sore throats and sore moods alike. You taste both bowls in turns and decide that the plainer one makes for easier thinking, while the honeyed one feels like a hand smoothing your brow. The tavern's cat, who has clearly made the rounds already, jumps onto the bench and looks at your bowl with an interest that is almost polite. You break a tiny corner of crust for it. The cat pretends not to notice, waits a full heartbeat, then accepts. On the wall hangs a bit of tavern humor, a carved sign of a man sitting down on a bench with a brave expression and great concentration. The joke requires the local story, how an ale taster in town once checked a brew's quality by sitting on a bench dusted with sticky wort to see if his leather breeches would cling. The more they stuck, the sweeter and less fermented the ale, or so the tale goes. It is not the most scientific method, and you would rather not test it, but the carving is cheerful, and the room enjoys it without analysis. This is the quirky sort of measure taverns keep alongside their sensible ones. Mash temperatures remembered by hand, yeast judged by the smell of its sigh, benches consulted by the bravest breeches. At the hearth, a small pot of herbs steams bog myrtle today, with a curl of something resinous that catches at the nose. Not every ale is hopped here. Hops travel with merchants and fashions, and their steady bitterness is a plant's argument that not everyone has learned yet to listen. Historians still argue about when hops truly settled into local brewing, and how quickly. Some alleys embraced the new flavor with relief. Others kept to older gruit blends, content with the soft herbal edges they knew. You sip and find only the faintest bite, more meadow than hedge, which suits a quiet evening. The bread in your bowl continues to relax. You press the back of your spoon against a piece and feel it yield, the crust and crumb agreeing to become something like porridge. It warms your mouth gently. You think of how bread meets liquid in so many disguises. Sops in ale, trenchers under stews, crusts softened in broth for the very young and the very old. The table becomes a soft place, and the day forgives tired teeth. The alewife passes again, setting a wedge of cheese beside the bowl, its edge sweating a little in the room's warmth. You cut it with the same knife she used for the bread, and lay a slice on top. Conversation never rises far here. It moves like a low wind through barley. Someone murmurs about a field that held water too long last autumn. Someone else recalls a neighbor who spent a night staring at the fire grate because the shadows would not stay obedient after a certain loaf. The words fall and settle like chaff after winnowing. No one names causes. They say, ill bread, and shrug with the weary wisdom of people who know that the world offers both good and strange. You finish slowly. The last sip of ale tastes clearer than the first, as if the tongue has remembered how to listen. You set the bowl aside and rest your hands on the table, feeling the grain of the wood under your palms. The alewife returns, collects the bowls, and gives you a look that says, "Eat well, go gently," which is close enough to a benediction for an ordinary evening. Outside, The light has slipped further. You step into the lane with the small, warm weight of your supper sitting agreeably in your stomach. The tavern's door closes behind you with a soft, wooden breath. For a while, you walk without thinking, letting the quiet of bread and ale do their work, and hoping, as everyone does that tonight, the dreams keep to their lanes. You set the shallow basket on your knees and lift the sieve, a circle of woven reeds tight as a drum. The mesh is wide enough to let small things through and stubborn enough to hold the kernels you want to keep. You tip a measure of grain into the mouth of the sieve, barley, bright as straw, rye dark as damp soil, and then you begin the little dance your hands know. Tilt, shake, settle, pause. The sound is a dry rain on a roof of reeds, steady and modest, like the weather promising nothing dramatic. Dust rises and lights itself in the slant of afternoon sun, a soft smoke without scent. You work near the open door, so the chaff and the small stones will find the yard instead of your floor. The day offers a friendly breeze, and you let it take a share of the refuse, watching it spin away like little brown moths. Sieves and winnowing baskets have lived in rooms like this for as long as anyone can remember. That is the simple truth, the everyday fact. A riddle with a tighter mesh waits by the hearth for finer work. A shallow tray rests beside it for tossing grain gently into the wind. The tools pile up in corners the way spoons pile near broth, quiet companions of making. As you shake, the first dark flecks begin to show themselves among the pale kernels. Some are the usual guests. Bits of husk, a tiny seed from a weed that insisted on living where the grain wanted to live, a crumb of earth that rode in on a boot. Others are smaller and stranger, shriveled fragments that look wrong even without a name, pieces that are almost purple-brown, almost black, shapes like withered claws or crooked teeth. You pick them out with 2 fingers and drop them into a small bowl, a little watchman's cup for things that do not belong. The rhythm settles. Each turn of your wrists brings the same small rain. You breathe with it, and the world narrows to the bowl and the sifted light and the low scrape of reeds on your palm. Now and then a kernel catches at the rim and leaps back as if remembering its place. A sparrow lands on the lintel outside and studies you, head tilted, then decides you are a creature of no immediate interest and flies on. The house cat drowses near your foot and wakes only when one of the darker bits skips free. It bats at it, offended that anything so small would dare to move without permission. You remember a neighbor's rule for doubtful grain. Pour a handful into water and see what floats. The good sinks to its rest, she used to say, and the bad is too light to settle. Whether that test has wisdom or only confidence, you cannot say. Quirky rules tend to travel faster than the careful ones, and every village collects a few favorites. You've tried it once or twice on a bucket by the door. Some bits did rise like hollow twigs, and you fished them out with a willow spoon, uneasy at their strange buoyancy. Still, the sieve in your hands feels more honest than a bucket's whisper. Near the hearth, a lamp waits with its wick trimmed for evening. You will use it later, when dusk turns the room the color of old honey, and sorting by sight asks for patience. For now, the sun stays long enough to make the work kindly. Historians still argue whether most households could reliably recognize the darker, dangerous fragments, the ones people whisper about when they say ill bread and hot loaf, or whether sight alone is a comfort that fails more often than it saves. Some say the signs were clear to trained eyes. Others say the grain hid its mischief too well in a season of heavy rain. You stop to rub your thumb against a kernel of rye, warming the husk until it brightens. The smell it releases is clean and a little sharp, like a meadow after the first cut. You do the same with one of the dark pieces, and find no such comfort, only a bitter trace that sits on the tongue and refuses to turn sweet. You spit lightly into your palm out of habit, not disgust, the way old people taught you to chase an unwelcome taste. It is not proof, but it is persuasion enough for hands that must decide quickly. A child peeks around the doorframe and asks if he can help. You hand him the second sieve, the tighter one, and show him how to rock it in a small circle, rather than shake it like a rattle. He tries both ways, and adopts your circle at once, solemn as a novice at prayer. From time to time he holds up a kernel like a jewel and asks, "This one?" You nod or shake your head, and the little bowl grows heavier by grains that do not belong to supper. The pile of cleaned grain in your tray grows too. You tip it into a linen-lined bin and hear the more graceful sound of safe kernels accepting neighbors. You run your fingers through the surface and smooth it flat, drawing a simple line with the side of your hand, the way people draw a line on bread dough before it meets the oven. The line is for nothing practical. It is for the mind, a small proof that order can be made by gesture. A thought arrives, uninvited but not unwelcome. The stories of those who ate a certain bread and then spent the night watching the edges of their world run like dye in warm water. People call it saint's fire in some places because it burns the limbs and confuses the senses and seems to come from nowhere. In truth, it comes from somewhere very small and very patient that lives with rye when the season goes wrong. That is what some say. Others insist the oven is to blame, or the ale, or a fever that shows its hour unwisely. Historians still argue whether villagers connected the worst nights to the darkest kernels with any certainty, or whether the link only hardened later in stories told with hindsight and hope. You return to the sieve. The motion comforts you. The afternoon moves by in small measures, the length of a handful, the time it takes dust to settle, the space between two sparrow flights. You begin to hum without knowing what tune you've chosen. It is not a song anyone taught you. It is the sound your hands make when they are content to repeat themselves. The child hums along, half a note behind, and for a moment the room feels like a very small mill, bodies turning, grain becoming, time softening into usefulness. When the last scoop has been sifted, you set the sieve upright against the wall to let the breeze clean it. You hold the bowl of dark fragments and tilt it so the light can look closely. Some pieces show the purple-brown sheen that made you suspicious. Some are merely tired barley, tight and old. You do not pretend to know everything. You know enough to choose caution for the worst-looking handful and kindness for the hens with the rest. The child, who has watched your face rather than the bowl, nods solemnly as if you've given a sermon. Perhaps you have, though the words were all in your hands. You step outside and lift the tray chest high. The breeze is still there, faithful as a broom. You pour the chaff and dust into it and watch the light stuff fly down the lane, harmless at last. A few pale husks snag on a nettle by the fence and glitter like moth wings. Behind you, the house breathes cool through its open door. Before you, the yard smells of sun-warmed straw and the last of the afternoon's heat. You carry the clean grain to the jar and listen for that final calm sound as it pours. A deeper rain, the sound of a small storehouse filling. When the jar is capped with its cloth and cord, you press your palm to its lid for a moment, not as a charm, simply as a habit of gratitude to the field, to the river wheel, to the sieve, to the day that stayed dry. Then you rinse the bowl, shake the sieve once more, and let both lean in the shade where tools rest the way animals do, quietly and in company. Evening will come, and with it firelight and dough and the oven's patient mouth. For now, you let your shoulders drop, and you feel the lightness that follows neat piles and sensible tasks. You know that care does not promise certainty. You know it still helps. You leave the door open to invite the night's cooler air, and as you turn away, the cat steals your empty spot and sits squarely in the shallow tray, a small guardian of the space where doubtful seeds no longer lie. You reach the market just as the day decides to loosen its shoulders. The square is a shallow bowl of sound, low voices, hoof steps, the faint clink of a scales pan, but nothing sharp, nothing that hurries. Along the eastern awning stands the bread bench, a long plank on trestles rubbed silky by years of elbows and the slide of round loaves. Heat still rises from the wood, as if the bench itself has learned to keep a baker's warmth. You join the slow river of bodies that drifts past without pushing. The loaves wait in tidy ranks, rounds of rye as dark as damp bark, pale barley domes dusted like frost, and a few long shapes for households that like easier slicing into stews. Each carries a shallow cut across its back, the baker's sign. A cross, a pair of lines, a leaf, a fish. Marks like these keep the world honest when communal ovens send many families' bread home together. You rest two fingers on a crust and feel a steady heat that promises a gentle evening. A woman behind the bench minds a balance scale whose arms are patient as a clock that refuses to tell time. She lifts a loaf, sets it on the pan, and lets iron speak. With the other hand, she nests small weights on the opposite plate disc, then disc the soft clink like rain on a lid. In many towns and cities, bread is leashed to law, price and weight tied to the cost of grain. So a deer harvest shrinks loaves rather than coins multiplying unfairly. It is the mainstream fact everyone breathes here, even if few could recite the wording. Historians still argue how strict those rules were beyond the larger towns, whether small markets like this enforced weight and price with firm attention, or whether custom and watchful neighbors did most of the work, while officers arrived mostly on feast days. You can believe either story. The scales pan is well used, so are the eyes of the woman who minds it. Both look like they remember too many harvests to be easily fooled. A man to your left taps the base of a loaf with a knuckle and listens. The sound is hollow and pleasing, like a quiet drum. He nods and sets it back. Rings true, he says to no one in particular. The tapping is one of the market's little games, a quick, quirky test that claims to tell whether a loaf is baked through. It is not a perfect science, but it comforts hands that like to know things by sound. Another buyer lifts a loaf to his nose and inhales with the seriousness of a monk before a psalm. Smell travels straighter than rules do. You edge forward. The baker wipes his palms on his apron and offers each buyer a practiced half-smile. He has the look of a man who already put in his day and now lets bread do the speaking. From time to time, he peeks past the awning to measure the sun and the distance to the bell that ends the market. At his feet, a boy threads straw through 2 loaves to make handles for someone whose hands are already busy with cheese, onions, and patience. Straw handles are a small convenience that looks like a trick and works like one. Your turn arrives. You ask for a round of rye and a smaller barley loaf. The rye settles into its number. The barley hesitates, then agrees with a tiny shiver, as if deciding to behave. The woman nods and scratches a neat line on a wax tablet with a bone stylus. She will tally at dusk, warm the tablet, smooth it clean, and begin again tomorrow. You pay in dull, familiar coins that seem to carry the taste of iron. The baker returns a sliver of change and a small courtesy nod that says bread and buyer have done right by each other. The square keeps its soft business. A cheesemonger hums as he trims a wheel. A potter stacks bowls so each mouth kisses the next bowl's foot. A pig snores under a cart and startles only when someone drops a lid. The bread bench moves to its own rhythm. Choose, weigh, pay, nod. A crier wanders through and sings a line about a lost glove in a tone usually saved for fires. The bench listens politely and returns to not being in a hurry. You ask after the wheat field beyond the hill. The baker shrugs a careful shrug. Wheat is a guest here, respected but not relied upon. Rye and barley are the village's daily crumb. Historians still argue whether that mix truly shifted with prosperity, whether fashion ever replaced dark loaves at the center of the table, or whether white crumb remained mostly a feast day surprise outside richer towns. The answer hides in ledgers that forgot kitchens and in kitchens that never wrote ledgers. A thin woman with ink-stained fingers, perhaps a scribe's helper, asks for 2-day-old loaves. The baker offers them for a smaller coin and says, "Yesterday's bread makes the best sops." She nods. Dry bread keeps its dignity in broth. You think of quiet economies. Crusts to the pot, crumbs to the sausage, ends toasted and pounded to coat a fish. Bread wastes as little as a careful house allows. Nearby, a narrow basket hangs with notched wooden tallies. Some households leave one in the morning to reserve loaves and collect them at noon. Quirky, yes, but it keeps bread walking to the right doors. Down the bench, a quarrel doesn't quite become one. A man insists a loaf is light. The woman with the scale sets it on the pan, adds weights until the arms balance like a still pond, and raises an eyebrow as if to say the iron has spoken. The man's mouth compresses into an apology that never finds words. He leaves with the loaf tucked under his arm in a sheepish crescent. The bench absorbs the moment and returns to its slow commerce, proof that markets prefer correction to drama. Another buyer presses a small personal stamp into the flour dust on his crust, a private mark to find the loaf later among many cooling rounds at the oven. It will brush away, but for now it pleases him to see his sign sitting on the bread like a tame moon. Historians still argue how common such marks were outside gilded city bakehouses, or whether in villages the slash of the baker's knife was proof enough of origin. The evidence leans and wobbles like any pile of loaves cooling on a reed mat. You step aside and cradle your loaves. The heat has gentled but not vanished. The rye warms your forearm like a sleeping cat. You tilt the barley and listen just once to the little drum of its crust. It answers politely. A fly dares the awning's shade and is shooed by a sprig of rosemary. The baker keeps in a jar of water for exactly that task. For a breath, the bench smells like a garden that learned to bake. A boy laughs at nothing in particular, and the laugh folds neatly into the square. Before you go, you ask if there will be feast loaves next week. The baker's eyes light. Birds and plats, he says. If the oven behaves. The answer draws a small, satisfied murmur from those nearby, the sound a village makes when everyday tools turn festive on command. Historians still argue whether such shaped breads belonged mostly to city guilds or whether rural ovens also played at feathers and flowers whenever there was time and fuel to spare. Evidence arrives in fragments, like crumbs on a board that no one thought to save. You make one last circle of the square, letting your loaves cool by inches. The crier finds his glove. The pig resigns itself to being awake. The cheesemonger changes keys. Light slides across the bench until it rests like a warm hand on the last row. When you rub your palms, a fine flurry falls, very small snow that smells of oven and field. You turn toward the lane with bread that is simply bread. Warm, well-made, likely to behave. And yet seasons keep memories, and rye listens too closely to rain, so a thin thread of uncertainty travels with you, the quiet possibility that a harmless supper might invite the night to paint the edges of the world a little brighter than it should. You lift the wooden latch and let the door sink inward on its leather hinges. The cellar greets you with the small cool of stone, an air that seems to have kept the night for itself, even while the rest of the house took up day. A step down, then two, the tread of your feet changing from wood to packed earth, from the creak of boards to the hush of below. The smell rises to meet you, damp and clean in its way, like a wool cloak dried indoors after rain, a breath of stone powdered by time, and, under both, a suggestion of grain that has waited longer than it prefers. Your hand finds the wall and follows the roughness of lime wash. The white keeps the gloom from swallowing the room entirely, catching what little light comes through a small slit window near the lintel. It also offers the comfort of freshening, a surface people renew when spring turns the world decent again. Bins line one side, wide-mouthed and quiet, each with a lid and a stone set atop. Sacks crouch along the other, bellies bound with cord and marked with chalk. Between them runs a narrow path, no wider than 2 steady feet, so that you must breathe in to pass and breathe out to turn. You pause to listen. A cellar has its own clock. Drips count slow seconds in a far corner. A cask settles with a sigh that could be memory or impatience. Above, a chair leg speaks once and falls silent again. Somewhere, crumbs think about moving and then reconsider. You reach for a rushlight and coax its flame, holding it low so it will not snatch the ceiling. The light paints the room in honey and soot, and you begin the small inspection that belongs to cellars. Eyes, nose, hand, patience. You lift the lid and lean in. Grain holds the day's warmth longer than stone does, but down here both cool to the same steady temperature. People store many things in cellars: ale, apples, cheese. Quiet arguments, but the bins that matter to your evening hold what becomes bread. The top layer of kernels looks fine, a dry shine where the light lands, a pleasant hush when your fingers make a small furrow. You pinch a few and warm them between thumb and forefinger until their smell wakes. Meadow, bitter and sweet at once, like a story that knows its ending but tells itself slowly anyway. Cellars in houses like this are common enough, a fact as ordinary as rain that forgets to be dramatic. Cool rooms beneath kitchens, beside hearths, beneath churches, in barns hold harvest against time, letting families cross from autumn's plenty to late winter's strictness without too much pleading. In towns, the great tithe barns and public granaries shoulder more of the carrying. In villages, the work rests in smaller rooms where hands remember every knot in every sack. You think of the larger barns, their doors tall enough for dignity, their floors raised to deny damp, and you nod to the cellar for managing the same work in a humbler length. You unbind a sack's throat and put your face near the mouth. A goods store smells dry even when the air is cool. A bad store smells of stew before any pot has been set upon the fire. You harvest the difference with your nose. This one sits between mostly fine, but with an edge that makes you pay attention. Historians still argue whether households trained their noses to read this as warning, whether people could reliably tell by scent alone that rain had had its way with a field and left a mischief inside the rye, or whether such sensing is a kindness we write backward from later knowledge. The truth, like most cellar air, probably lies somewhere between. Sometimes the nose knows. Sometimes it is only proud of itself. You work the grain with your hand, lifting a handful from the cloth and letting it fall back in a small, even rain. You watch for what you have been taught to watch. Withered kernels that look like seed turned to thorn. Fragments that are not the friendly brown of bran but the deep, bruised purple brown of something that keeps its own counsel. Bits that cling to fingers with a stubbornness not found in good grain. You pick these out and set them in a shallow dish kept for exactly that purpose. The dish waits on a ledge by the door, like a sentinel's logbook. A quirky habit belongs to this room. Someone, perhaps your grandmother, perhaps the house itself, once hammered a bent horseshoe into the jamb beside the cellar door. For wet luck, the old voice said, meaning the kind of fortune that creeps into sacks as mist and leaves as trouble. You touch the iron now, the way you always do on the way in and out. You do not claim it works any better than a careful nose and an honest sieve, but cellars are places where modest rituals feel as useful as tools. On the lintel hangs a bundle of dried tansy and rosemary, smell-fierce plants meant to persuade insects to pack their bags. Whether they persuade or merely perfume is another question you do not ask too loudly. You check the corners. Corners are where cellars whisper. A shadow that stays damp after 3 dry days means a stone has learned to drink. A film on a cask suggests a bung that needs attention. A small white lace on the wall means lime wash wants renewing. The bins look content. One shows a hint of clumping where the last scoop rested a little too long. You break it gently with your fingers and stir the top 3 hand breadths, so the upper layer does not become a skin. The sound of kernels rediscovering each other pleases you more than you admit. The slit window lets in a finger of air. You unlatch it and push the shutter out just enough to trade a little cellar breath for a little evening wind. Some folks say to do this only in dry weather. Others say a cellar must be taught the habit of breathing every day, lest it grow sulky. Historians still argue whether domestic cellars had planned vents and flues, or whether most relied on happenstance gaps in stone, loose hinges, stairs that behaved like chimneys when cooks grew busy. The drawings left from old builders are half instruction, half poetry, and the houses that remain were touched by 100 hands after the first ones left. You kneel and look beneath the lowest shelf. Straw keeps the earth honest here, laid down in plats to welcome any damp that comes nosing around. In one corner sits a shallow dish, just ash, and a line of salt, someone's quiet border against ants. The dish has caught a few bodies, and you tip it away from the grain with a basilisk stare you save for small thieves. In the other corner, a spider keeps a tidy web, and you thank it without making a show of it. Cellars are made by hands, but maintained by many small colleagues. From the stair, you hear a voice ask if the rye will be ready for the weekend loaf shaped like a bird. You answer that it will, with attention. The word attention does the work of a tally, a sieve, an afternoon sun. You take up a small scoop and fill a linen bag with what looks and smells trustworthy. The bag feels a little heavier than your expectation, which you take as a politeness offered by gravity on a kind day. Tied, it goes over your shoulder in a way that makes it part of your posture. You stand a long moment before leaving. The room returns your gaze with the calm of things that continue, whether they are watched or not. You think of how many winters have been crossed on the narrow back of rooms like this, where temperature and patience were the only technologies anyone could afford. You think, too, of years when the valley was rain busy at harvest, and the bread that followed asked for a price no one intended to pay. Some call it saint's fire, when it takes hold the burning in limb and mind that follows a loaf touched by something that grew in the wrong weather. Others call it a fever and fold the blankets tighter. Historians still argue whether households marked those bad nights against specific bins and sacks, whether the ledger of cause and effect was written in noses and memories, or whether luck did most of the writing while people did the reading afterward. You cap the bins, smooth the sacks, and lower the rushlight's flame with a careful breath, At the door, your fingers find the iron again because they always do, and you climb the steps. The house's warmer air meets you at the top like a shawl. Behind you, the cellar resumes its careful counting of drips and sighs. Ahead of you, the table waits for an evening that hopes for ordinary bread and ordinary dreams. You carry both, the hope in your hands, the caution in your nose. You find the baker's apprentices in the narrow space behind the main hearth, where the air is always warm but never quite as hot as the oven's mouth. They stand at a long table dusted in flour so fine it clouds slightly when their sleeves brush across it. Their hands press into the dough with the steadiness of people who have done it too many times to think much about the order of it. Push forward, fold back, turn. Push forward, fold back, turn. The rhythm is quiet and constant, like the swing of a slow pendulum. The table holds 3 great lumps of dough, each nearly the size of a sleeping dog. The apprentices lean into their work, shoulders rocking with each press. The surface of the dough darkens slightly where the pressure forces the air out, then springs back in soft protest. The flour sticks to their skin, making their fingers look pale even in the golden light. One wipes his nose with the back of his wrist and leaves a long streak like chalk on a wall. Neither of them speaks, though once in a while one hums a note or two, letting it fade before the other can tell what song it wanted to be. Kneading is the muscle of bread making, the quiet labor that turns soft, sticky promise into something elastic and strong enough to trap the air that will lift it in the oven. That is the everyday fact. It has been the same for centuries, changing only in who does the work. Apprentices here, grandmothers elsewhere, a lone household cook in some corner kitchen. Historians still argue whether kneading was always as thorough in every setting, or whether in some households the dough went into the oven softer and less worked, yielding denser loaves that suited local taste. From time to time, the master baker passes behind them, his eyes narrowing in a quick judgment of their progress. He says nothing, but his hand falls to the dough for a single press, a kind of wordless correction. They adjust without complaint. The dough knows when it is being handled by someone who has learned its moods. The apprentices will learn them too, how rye dough asks for a firmer hand than wheat, how barley prefers to be coaxed rather than bullied. You lean closer and watch the surface of one lump as it stretches under the apprentice's hands. Tiny bubbles appear and vanish, like fish rising in a pond. The smell here is subtler than in the oven room. Less toast, more yeast, with a faint shadow of the flour's own scent. You could stand here breathing it until the light changes. One apprentice pauses to dust the table, lifting the dough and sprinkling flour beneath it to keep it from sticking. The flour falls in a thin veil, catching the light in drifting motes. The other works without pause, his palms squeaking faintly against the damp surface. Now and then a lump of dough sighs as it folds over itself. It is the kind of sound that makes you glance up, though it never means anything is wrong. On a shelf above the table sits a wooden bowl of coarse salt, a crock of honey, and a small jar of crushed fennel seed for tomorrow's baking. The fennel waits with a promise of sweetness that is not sweet, a fragrance that belongs as much to bread as to feast meat. A small square of linen covers it, but the scent escapes anyway, and you breathe it in without meaning to. A quirky habit belongs to this room. Each apprentice, before setting the dough for its first rise, presses a thumb into its surface, deep enough to leave a hollow that takes a moment to smooth. So it remembers who worked it, one says when he notices you looking. Whether that is true or just a story told to make the task less endless, you cannot say, but you like the idea of bread carrying a faint signature in its skin. Historians still argue whether such small marks were ever made with real intention, or whether the occasional dent was only the byproduct of handling. After a while, the dough grows smoother, less eager to stick, more willing to stretch. The apprentices divide it into smaller rounds, each one rolled tight and set aside under a cloth. The cloth itself smells faintly of past bakings, a warm ghost that seems to encourage the dough underneath. You can see the slow lift already beginning, the surface swelling gently as the yeast continues its work. The master reappears, this time with a board of loaves cooling from the morning's bake. He sets it near the apprentices so they can see the day's end while they shape its beginning. The crusts are split and shining, the bottoms dusted with the pattern of the reed mat they cooled upon. One loaf is set aside with a small, knowing look perhaps for the master's own supper, or perhaps for the first customer who arrives tomorrow with a story worth hearing. You step back, letting the apprentices finish without the feeling of being watched. The kneading continues in its slow, patient rhythm. A beam of light creeps across the table, turning the flour into a pale shimmer. Outside, you hear the muffled clop of hooves and the call of a vendor selling onions. Inside, the dough moves from raw to ready under steady hands, the air warming just enough to promise that, in time, the oven will be filled again. You think, not for the first time, that this moment when dough is not yet bread, when the day is not yet evening, holds its own kind of peace. And you wonder, as others have before you, whether a loaf that begins under such patient care can still carry a hidden mischief from the grain it came from. Historians still argue this too, whether skill and good handling could quiet such trouble, or whether some things refuse to be worked out by any amount of folding and turning. The apprentices cover the last round, wipe their hands on their aprons, and stand back. The table is scattered with a thin dusting of flour, like the first powder of frost in autumn. The master nods once and sends them to fetch more firewood for the oven. You watch them go, their hands still carrying the warmth and scent of the work. Then you turn toward the door, the image of rising dough stored somewhere quiet in your mind, alongside the knowledge that patience and care do not always grant certainty, but they are worth practicing all the same. You crouch near the oven's mouth and feel the ground's heat before your palms touch it, a steady warmth that has crept outward along the stones like a quiet tide. The floor inside is flat and dark, rubbed satin smooth by years of loaves arriving, swelling, and leaving with new names. A little crescent of flour that fell earlier has browned to a pale gold stain, the curve of it like a moon in a soot-black sky. The baker kneels beside you and uses the peel not as a paddle but as a ruler, sliding its edge just inside to scrape away a soft grit of ash. The sound stone against wood makes a thin, familiar note, a kitchen string plucked without hurry. Bread's here baked directly on the oven floor, a fact as everyday as rain deciding to stop before it ruins hay. The heat climbs from beneath, licks the belly of each loaf, and seals it to itself before the top has finished speaking to the air. You could say this is the way most ovens you know behave. Stones holding yesterday's fires like a memory, returning them as today's work. In some towns, the oven belongs to everyone, a big domed room of heat where families arrive in turn, carrying scored dough on boards and leaving with round quiets wrapped in cloth. Historians still argue how often such communal ovens replaced household hearths in villages like this, whether most people came here by habit, or only when fuel ran short and the shared mouth promised a better bake. The baker squints into the dark and judges what the flame has done. There is no clock for this. He reads color and listens. The soot that clung to the dome earlier has burned clean in patches, leaving pale islands that tell him the ceiling is hot enough to reflect heat downward. The floor shows its own map darker near the door, brighter at the back. He lifts a palm to the opening and counts to himself. Not numbers so much as a slow verse learned long ago. When his breath stops asking questions, he nods. The floor is ready to teach dough how to be bread. Before the first loaf enters, he performs the room's small ceremony. He tosses a pinch of flour onto the floor and watches how quickly it blushes and smokes. The baker calls it kissing the stone, a tender name for such a practical test. Quirky as it sounds, the kiss tells him what he needs. A blush that comes too fast means the floor will scorch. Too slow, and the loaf will take its time in a way that offends the dinner hour. Today, the blush arrives like good gossip, quick, warm, then done. Satisfied, he reaches for a small bundle of rye straw and brushes the floor in 2 quick sweeps. Straws hiss, ash drifts, and the path is clean. You edge closer and lay your fingers lightly on the threshold stone. Old warmth lives there, the kind that makes you think of sleeping dogs and contented cats. The smell inside is a layered thing. Char, flour, the almost sweet breath of yesterday's loaves that lingers in the pores of stone, and the deeper scent of clay baked into a permanent temper. Your eyes adjust to the glow, and you follow the peel's tip as it slides, pivots, withdraws. Loaf after loaf meets the floor with a quiet, decisive sigh. 3 at the back, 3 at the side, 3 nearer the mouth. The arrangement is not random. The baker places the darker rye where the heat holds heaviest. The paler barley he keeps closer to himself, to watch. The floor's work begins immediately. You can see where the bottoms of the rounds change from soft to steady, the edges firming as if remembering their own skins. There is a tiny halo around each loaf where steam meets cooler air and makes the briefest ghost. You think of the reed mats waiting on the shelf-woven trays that will accept the hot loaves later without scalding their undersides. The mats tattoo each loaf with a faint pattern as it cools, proof of the floor's heat meeting the air's patience. The baker turns one loaf just a hand's breadth with the tip of the peel, as if adjusting a child's pillow. He is balancing the oven's small climates back to front, left to right, places where last night's firing warmed one stone more than its neighbors. Historians still argue how precisely bakers could read such micro-weather, whether they worked by clear rules or by long, inherited instinct that never made it into anyone's tidy description. You suspect the answer rests in hands, not words. The peel knows where it has been. The floor knows who is using it. The dome listens and returns what it can. From the far end of the room, an apprentice arrives with 2 shallow bowls of water and a sprig of rosemary laid across one. The baker dips the sprig and flicks a few drops toward the oven's mouth. They spatter and flash to steam with a tiny whisper, softening the crusts just enough to let them rise a little higher before the surface hardens. Some bakers toss water with their fingertips, some clap wet hands, others trust the dough alone. The rosemary is a house quirk, a scent gift to the moment that leaves no taste after. The apprentice grins at you for noticing, and then pretends he wasn't grinning. The floor keeps talking in small pops as the loaves grow. You hear the crusts announcing themselves, micro cracks that start near the scores and travel outward like thin rivers on a map. One loaf lifts a shoulder as if stretching after a nap. Another settles deeper. Content. The baker slides the peel under the nearest round, lifts it just enough to peek beneath, and nods. The bottom shows a color he likes, brown deep enough to promise flavor, not so dark that dinner will accuse him of haste. He draws one loaf forward for turning. The peel slips under with the ease of long courtship. He rotates the bread a hand's quarter and pushes it back. Each turn matters. Each interval matters. In larger city bakehouses, guild rules tie such work to measures and marks, to apprentices learning by rote before the freedom of instinct arrives. Here, the rules are older than memory and softer than law. But the floor does not forgive sloppiness any more than a judge would. A story belongs to this oven, one the apprentices tell when the night is long. The time the floor stone cracked in winter, and the baker mended it with a coin pressed into the gap, hammering it flat so the peel would not catch. Whether the coin improved the heat or simply shone like a secret during raking, no one agrees. You have tried to spot the glint and never can. Perhaps the coin lies exactly where the best loaves sit. Perhaps the story is only there to remind the floor that people notice it. Quirky stories tame serious tools. You sit back on your heels and let the warmth creep up your shins. The oven breathes. The room breathes with it. Outside, somewhere, a cart rolls past, a wheel ticking a stone in the lane with the stubborn regularity of a person who refuses to step around a puddle. Inside, the baker counts his heartbeats between glances and adjusts nothing for 3 long breaths, which is its own kind of decision. When the first round is ready, the peel slides home and lifts it free. The loaf rides out like a ship from a harbor, bottom firm, sides singing faintly as cooler air kisses hot crust. He sets it on a reed mat, and the mat answers with a dry rustle. Steam unspools in a thin banner, carrying the oven's alphabet to the room. Grain, fire, patience. He presses his ear to the crust, just for a breath, and smiles at the murmuring some bakers say a good loaf talks as it cools, the crust crackling like a tiny fire. Whether that is truth or poetry, it is a habit worth keeping. Historians still argue when and where such listening began, whether it traveled from one city's guild to another's, or whether every baker everywhere discovered it in the same companionable moment of curiosity. More loaves follow, each one adopting the reed mat's pattern, each one adding its share to the room's weather. The floor, relieved of weight, shows a temporary paler ring where a loaf rested, a ghost that will darken again as the next round takes its place. The rhythm continues. In turn, check out. The oven yields its heat the way a careful host pours ale enough to satisfy, never so much that the last guest goes thirsty. When the last loaf of this firing settles on its mat, the baker slides the peel to the wall and rests his palm flat on the oven lip in a brief, companionable gesture. You mirror him without thinking, feeling the residual heat settle into your skin. The floor inside glows so faintly you might be imagining it. The room smells like answers to simple questions. For a while, you and the baker and the floor share the same silence. Bread has its own way of finishing thoughts. Later there will be cooling racks and shared slices and careful tapping that sounds like approval. For now, the stone floor has told its story as it always does, without words, without haste, leaving just enough warmth for a hand to find and remember. You step into the small side room where sacks wait to be opened, and the smell changes at once. It is not the warm scent of baking here, nor the simple grain-dry air of the storehouse. This is sharper, more insistent, the smell of grain that met water too soon and has been quietly brooding about it ever since. It is sweet in the way fruit can be sweet, when it's gone a day past its welcome, edged with something sour that lingers in the nose. You lift the nearest sack and feel its weight shift in a sluggish way, as if the kernels inside have learned to cling to one another. The baker stands by a bench with a shallow wooden tub in front of him. He has opened a sack and tipped part of it out, spreading the grain with both hands. The colors tell their own tale. Pale gold barley, dark rye, and here and there a kernel that seems stained from within purple-brown, almost black, with a twisted shape as though it was never sure which way to grow. These dark ones roll less freely, catching against the others as if asking to be noticed. The baker picks them out and sets them aside in a small clay bowl without comment. Damp grain is an old enemy, as ordinary a hazard as dull knives or smoke in the eyes. Historians still argue whether medieval bakers and millers understood just how dangerous certain kinds of spoilage could be, whether they could truly link the wrong harvest weather to the strange visions and burning limbs. Some villagers suffered after a loaf. Some think the connection was only guessed at, folded into tales about curses or fevers. Others believe skilled hands could see trouble in the grain itself and tried, as best they could, to keep it from the oven. You take a handful from the tub and feel the slight give of the dampness. Good grain is firm, each kernel moving easily against its neighbors. This feels a little soft, as though the weather has already begun to borrow from it. You roll a few between your fingers and bring them to your nose. The scent is faintly earthy, but with a shadow of something musty at the edge, a smell that wants you to be cautious. A quirky saying comes to mind, one you heard from an old farmer. If the grain smells like an old coat, let the hens wear it. It makes no perfect sense, but the meaning is clear enough. The baker pours the grain back into the sack, but not before running it through his fingers a final time. The dark kernels in the clay bowl are more numerous than you would like. He tilts them into a separate sack, tying the mouth tight and marking it with a chalk X. You ask what will happen to them. He shrugs and says they may go to the pigs, or they may be buried in the garden's far corner. Not every gift from the field belongs on the table, he adds. In the far corner of the room, a sieve leans against the wall, its mesh taut and clean. On the shelf above it, a handful of bay leaves lies scattered between folded cloths. The leaves are not for flavor here. They are to discourage small, winged visitors from making themselves too much at home in the sacks. Whether the bay leaves truly work or just give people the feeling of working, you cannot say, but their green-gray smell is pleasant. A cat slips in through the open door, nose twitching, tail high. It walks the length of the sacks and pauses by one, sniffing with clear suspicion. The baker chuckles and says the cat has a good sense for pests but no talent for sorting grain. Still, he lets it stay, knowing that a cat's presence keeps certain troubles at bay without the need for leaves or charms. The light in here comes from one small window high on the wall. Dust and chaff drift lazily in the beam, turning in the slow air. You stand in it for a while, listening to the soft movements of the baker's hands in the grain, the occasional rustle of the cat's paws on the floor. The sound is steady, repetitive, as much a part of bread making as kneading or tending the oven's fire. The baker reaches for another sack, this one tighter and drier to the touch. When he opens it, the smell is fresher, cleaner, dry straw and sun-warmed earth. The grain runs smoothly into the tub, each kernel bright and hard, and you both breathe more easily. He grins faintly, and you know without asking that this sack will find its way into the next day's loaves. The dark bowl is emptied again, but this time with only a token few inside. Historians still argue whether most bakers would have discarded large amounts of suspicious grain or whether hunger and scarcity forced them to take the risk more often than they admitted. Some evidence suggests that when supplies ran low, people relied more on thorough baking to make bread safe, trusting heat to drive out whatever harm might be lurking. Others doubt the oven's power over certain troubles, saying the harm was in the very substance of the grain. You cannot answer the question, but as you watch the baker work, you see the quiet choice he makes in each handful. When the grain is sorted and sacked again, the baker sweeps the bench with a flat hand, gathering stray kernels into a small pile and tipping them into the good sack. The floor is brushed clean, and the chaff is pushed into a corner for the broom. The cat finds a patch of sunlight near the door and curls up, satisfied that no mouse has dared to intrude on its patrol. You follow the baker outside, blinking in the change of light. Behind you, the room holds its mixed scents, damp and dry, caution and relief. In your mind, you carry both, the warmth of good grain ready for the mill, and the uneasy memory of kernels that rolled heavy and strange under your fingertips. Somewhere between those two lies the daily work of bread, and the fine line between an ordinary loaf and one that carries more than nourishment into the night. You sit at a long trestle table in the shade of an open doorway, the late afternoon light slanting across its worn boards. The loaf before you is round and dark, the rye crust dusted lightly with flour that leaves a faint print on your fingertips. It was baked this morning, and the smell of it still clings earthy, warm, with the faintest echo of the oven stone. Around you, others take their places. A wheelwright with wood shavings in his hair, an old woman in a blue kerchief, two children who swing their legs impatiently as they wait. The host, a broad-shouldered man with a kindly stoop, takes a knife from the wall and draws it across the loaf surface. The crust yields with a muted crackle, and the knife's edge disappears into the soft crumb. He cuts it not into neat slices, but into thick, uneven wedges, each with both crust and soft middle. The wedges are passed by hand. No plates, only palms and laps. You take one, the warmth settling into your skin. Sharing bread is as ordinary here as drawing breath. The same loaf might feed a family at the midday meal, neighbors after work in the fields, or strangers brought together by weather or news. It is not ceremony, there is no blessing, no speech, yet the act feels like one. The loaf's life is brief once cut. Its purpose is to be gone before the day ends. Historians still argue whether in small villages bread was more often shared like this, in pieces torn from a common round, or whether each household kept to its own loaf and table. The truth may lie somewhere between, shifting with season, harvest, and the mood of the baker. Your wedge sits heavy in your hand, its crust firm but not hard, its crumbs speckled with the darker flecks of bran. You press your thumb into it and feel the soft give, the way it springs back slowly, as though reluctant to lose its shape. You tear away a piece and chew. The taste is steady and plain, with a whisper of sourness that lingers in the rye. There is comfort in that flavor, in its refusal to pretend to be anything but itself. A small plate of salt sits at the center of the table. People dip their crusts into it before eating, the grains clinging to the moist edges. A pot of soft cheese is passed the same way, a small spoon resting inside. Someone produces a crock of pickled onions from under the bench, and their sharp scent cuts briefly through the bread's calm warmth. Each addition is offered without fuss, a quiet generosity that does not wait for thanks. At your left, the old woman in the kerchief breaks her wedge in two and passes the smaller half to a child across from her. The child grins and shoves the whole piece into his mouth, cheeks swelling like a squirrel's. At your right, the wheelwright chews slowly, nodding as if in conversation with the bread itself. The host tears his own wedge into three, handing pieces to those still without, and keeps for himself the smallest portion, as if to prove a point no one asked him to make. A saying drifts into your mind. A loaf cut is a loaf shared. You've heard it from different mouths, always in the same tone, a reminder and a comfort, a statement of fact and of choice. Quirky as it is, the phrase suits the moment. You imagine it scratched into a beam or stitched into the hem of a baker's apron, not because it changes anyone's habits, but because it tells them what they already know. The light shifts, the table bright on one side and shadowed on the other. Crumbs collect between the boards, small pale specks against the darker grain. A fly drifts down and is waved away without malice. Somewhere beyond the doorway, a cart passes, the muffled thud of its wheels softened by distance. A low murmur of conversation moves along the table. News of the market, the price of salt, a weather rumor about rain that will either bless or ruin the barley. The bread continues to pass from hand to hand. Each wedge diminishes. Each crust softens under fingers. Someone dips theirs into a mug of ale, letting it soak until it can be eaten without chewing. Another crumbles the last of their piece into a bowl of broth. You take your time with yours, aware of the small pleasure in holding the final mouthful for a beat before eating it. Historians still argue whether gatherings like this half meal, half rest were a daily habit in villages or more of a market day luxury. Some records suggest that work rarely paused for such leisure unless the day's tasks allowed it. Others speak of bread breaking as the very glue of small communities, the place where news and favors and quiet reconciliations were exchanged without any need for formal words. Watching this table, you believe either could be true, depending on the year and the harvest. The last crumbs are brushed from hands, the salt pot covered, the cheese crock returned to its place. The wheelwright leans back and sighs. The old woman wipes her fingers on her apron. The children dart away as if they've been holding still far too long. The host gathers the knife and hangs it back on its hook, the blade still faintly warm from the bread. You remain for a moment, feeling the weight of the meal settle comfortably. The air in the room is warmer now, filled with the smell of crust and cheese and the faint sharpness of onions. Outside, the light has softened toward evening. You know the bread will be gone entirely before night falls, as it always is. What remains is less tangible but no less real. The memory of hands passing food, the quiet of shared appetite, and the unspoken hope that tomorrow's loaf will be as sound as today's plances. You stand at the threshold of the granary, where the smell of harvest is stored like a season bottled. The door is wide enough for a wagon, its frame worn smooth by years of sacks brushing past. Inside, light falls through narrow slits high in the walls, the beams catching in dust that hangs like pale smoke. The floor is laid with thick planks, raised above the ground on stone piers to keep the damp earth's breath from touching the grain. The noise here is soft but constant. Somewhere, grain is being poured from a basket, the stream landing with the hush of sand into sand. The sound shifts as the pile grows, deepening until it muffles itself. You step onto the platform and feel the boards spring faintly under your weight. Along the far wall, a group of men tip baskets toward the center, building a mound that swells steadily upward. The kernels roll and tumble in miniature avalanches, sending the chaff spinning off to the edges. Granaries like this are the village's bank, its winter larder, and its quiet measure of fortune. That is the everyday fact. Families bring in their portion after the threshing, setting aside enough for their own tables and passing the rest into the community store for trade, rent, or in case the year ahead proves less generous. Historians still argue whether granaries in small villages were more about collective security or the Lord's due, whether the store's main role was to feed the people in lean months or to keep the manor's accounts in balance. The answer likely depends on whose hands held the keys. You walk closer to the growing mound. The grain shines where the light touches it, a blend of pale barley and darker rye. Here and there, a kernel catches in the gap between two boards, and an apprentice flicks it free with a fingertip. The air smells dry and faintly sweet, a scent that carries a low promise, warmth and full bellies when the ground outside is frozen. A man with a rake spreads the grain evenly, his strokes long and deliberate. The rake's wooden teeth leave parallel lines across the surface, like a field freshly plowed. Another man follows, scattering a pinch of dried rosemary over the top. It is a small, quirky habit more charm than preservation that some say keeps pests uneasy. Others claim it simply pleases the nose when the grain is turned later. you find yourself hoping it does both. In one corner stands a great balance scale, its chains polished by use. Sacks are weighed before their contents join the mound, each figure noted in a ledger kept in a leather pouch. The writing is spare numbers, marks, initials, yet each line holds the memory of fields, weather, and hands that sowed and cut. You glance over the entries and wonder how many seasons worth of these quiet calculations have passed without anyone thinking to call them history. The rake pauses, and the man bends to pick something from the grain, a kernel darker and more twisted than the rest. He tosses it into a small clay bowl at his side, half full already. You crouch to look closer. The dark kernels are easy to miss in the shifting light, but once your eyes adjust, they stand out like ink drops on parchment. The man says nothing about them. He has no need to, but you both know they are the kind of guests the oven should not welcome. Historians still argue whether such sorting was thorough in the past, or whether most ill grains slipped through unnoticed, unless the damage was obvious. Some accounts speak of long evenings spent by lamplight, fingers searching through small piles. Others suggest the task was left mostly to luck when the store was full and time was short. Here, at least today, there is time for care. A boy enters carrying a wicker basket of fresh threshed rye. He tips it onto the mound, and the grains roll downward in a narrow stream. You watch them mingle with the rest, the pile adjusting itself without complaint. The boy lingers a moment, pressing his bare toes into the edge of the mound as if testing its depth. The man with the rake frowns mildly, and the boy hops back, grinning. The smell of the place deepens as more grain is added. You breathe it in slowly, feeling the cool dryness in your nose and throat. There is no damp here, no hint of the cellar's sharpness, only the measured calm of a store built to wait. You think of winters when the snow lay thick and the wind found every gap in the shutters, when meals came from this room's generosity. And you think, too, of years when the grain carried hidden trouble, and the loaves that followed brought not comfort but strange dreams and burning limbs. At the far end, a ladder leans against the wall, reaching toward the upper slits where air drifts through. The slits are narrow enough to deny birds, but wide enough to let the room breathe. A few swallows have nested in the eaves, their quiet rustlings blending with the grain's own hush. The ladder's rungs are worn in the middle from years of climbing to open and close the shutters with the changing weather. When the last basket is emptied, the men smooth the mound and step back. The light catches in the ripples left by the rake, turning them briefly into waves on a still pond. The ledger is closed, the keys are looped back onto a leather belt, and the air settles into its slow rhythm again. You stand for a moment longer, letting the quiet wrap around you. The granary holds not just grain, but the memory of sun on fields, the sound of sickles, the dust of threshing floors. It holds, too, the uncertainty that rides in on every harvest, whether this store will feed comfort or mischief into the bread that waits in the months ahead. You step back into the doorway, blinking against the brighter light outside, and leave the granary to its long, patient keeping. You stand in the baker's workroom on a market eve, the air filled with a scent that is not quite everyday. On the long table sits a shallow wooden bowl, half full of coarse flour, already freckled with darker specks, crushed coriander seeds whose sharp, citrusy fragrance rises the moment you lean close. The baker tips a pinch into your palm, and you roll the fragments between your fingers. The smell blooms, both sweet and peppered, and lingers at the back of your throat. This is festival bread, a small luxury among the plain loaves of the week. Spices are too dear to waste on ordinary mornings. A jar of fennel seeds stands beside the coriander, and a pouch of caraway waits further down the table. Each spice has its own voice in bread, and here the baker blends them like notes in a tune only he knows. In some towns, such loaves are marked for feast days, shaped, scored, and perfumed to signal their special place on the table. Historians still argue whether these traditions traveled from market to market with merchants or sprang up separately in each village, drawn from whatever seeds the local soil and trade could offer. The baker lifts a small sack from a shelf and loosens its mouth. Inside is honey, thick and amber, folded into beeswax for storage. He cuts away a portion and drops it into a clay pot set near the fire. Slowly, it softens, turning liquid without boiling, until it pours in a steady ribbon into a bowl of warm water. The scent changes again. the air carrying a mellow sweetness that rounds the sharper edge of the spices. He works the mixture into the flour by hand, sprinkling in the spices as though feeding a fire with kindling. The dough darkens slightly, and the seeds stand out against its pale surface before disappearing into its folds. You notice how carefully he works each turn deliberate, each press matched with just enough force to blend without bruising. The apprentices watch in silence, knowing that these loaves carry a certain pride. A mistake here will not be forgiven as easily as in the daily round. In a corner of the room sits a carved wooden mold, worn at the edges. It leaves a relief pattern on the top of each loaf, spirals, leaves, and a small bird in the center. The baker says it is only for festival bread, so they know what they're getting before they taste it. The mold's design is deep enough to last through baking, but shallow enough not to split the crust. Whether the tradition began here or in some distant market town, he cannot say. Quirky as it is, the stamp tells a story before the first bite. The smell of coriander hangs heavy in the room now, mingling with the faint warmth of the oven next door. You've been told that some households toast the seeds before adding them, coaxing out a nuttier flavor, while others prefer them crushed raw for a brighter bite. Historians still argue which method was older, or if the choice was always just a matter of the baker's hand. Here, they go in raw, the better to let their sharpness survive the fire. The shaped loaves are laid on reed mats dusted with flour, their patterned tops catching the light like pressed coins. A damp cloth covers them, and the baker sets them near the hearth to rise. Now, the work slows. The apprentices sweep the table, gathering stray seeds and flour into a pile to be fed to the hens. The baker leans back against the wall and closes his eyes, listening to the faint creak of the loaves as they swell under the cloth. In the quiet, you think about how little spice it takes to change the feeling of bread. A pinch here, a scattering there, and the familiar crumb carries a different story, one of fairs, dances, and long tables dressed for guests. Yet you also think of years when the harvest was too poor for such luxuries, when even plain bread was more relief than celebration. The scent in the room now feels like a promise that this year is not one of those years. When the cloth is lifted, the loaves have risen enough to look pleased with themselves. The baker takes each one and sets it gently on the peel, sliding it into the oven with a motion so smooth it seems rehearsed for an audience that isn't there. The heat takes the scent of spice and honey and flings it into every corner. You breathe it in until your head feels light. Historians still argue whether such festival loaves were shared widely or kept mostly within a single household, whether their recipes traveled far or stayed guarded behind the closed shutters of a baker's kitchen. Watching the loaves settle into the oven's glow, you can imagine either. What is certain is that tomorrow, when the market bells ring and people wander past the bread bench, the air will carry this scent ahead of them, and they will follow it as if drawn by a rope they cannot see. For now, the room is warm, the patterns on the loaf tops slowly deepening as the crusts take their color. The baker stands with his arms folded, the apprentices pretending not to count the minutes. You stay where you are, letting the smell of coriander and honey settle into your clothes. Outside, the sky is shading toward evening, but in here, it is still bright with the anticipation of bread that exists for no reason except to be special. You push open the low door to the tavern, and the familiar warmth folds around you like a thick blanket. The air carries the mingled scents of malt, wood smoke, and the faint tang of spilled ale in the floorboards. At one of the trestle tables near the hearth, a pair of loaves rest on a platter beside a wedge of cheese and a small pot of mustard. Their crusts are dark, the rye baked deep, and a thin mist of steam still lifts from them. The tavern keeper slices into one loaf with a short, sturdy knife, the blade squeaking faintly against the crust before sinking into the soft crumb. She places the halves on the table, and the scent of warm bread rolls out into the room. Patrons look up, not all of them hungry, but all of them noting the arrival. She cuts the bread into thick hunks and sets them in a wooden bowl, passing it between a group of traders whose hands are still stained with road dust. Bread here is not just for eating alongside ale, it is part of the ale itself. The traders break the hunks into smaller pieces, dropping them into their mugs and letting the bread soak until it softens. One swirls the mug gently, the bread darkening as it takes on the ale's cloudy amber color. When he drinks, He scoops out a bite of sodden bread with a spoon, the crumb now carrying the ale's warmth and its faint bite of bitterness. It is an old habit, one you've seen in other taverns. Bread turned into sops for ale or broth, a meal and drink folded into one. Historians still argue whether this was done mostly for flavor or for frugality, whether it was a way to stretch the ale, soften stale bread, or simply a taste people grew to prefer. Whatever the reason, it turns the act of drinking into something slower, more filling, a meal you hold in your hand. The tavern keeper brings out the second loaf and tears it into rough quarters, passing them to a group of laborers who have just come in from the lane. They eat it plain, no cheese, no mustard, just the warmth of the bread itself. One leans back, closes his eyes, and chews with an expression that says, "This is enough for now." On the hearth's edge, a small iron pot simmers quietly. When the keeper lifts the lid, a savory steam escapes bits of onion, perhaps a shred or two of meat, herbs you cannot name without tasting. She takes a slice of bread, dunks it into the pot until the crust glistens, and passes it to a child perched on a stool. The child eats slowly, letting the broth drip back into the bowl between bites. There is a saying scratched into the beam above the bar: bread for the belly, ale for the talk. It is hard to tell whether it is advice or simple observation. Quirky as it is, it suits the place. The bread steadies the drink loosens the words. Around you, conversations turn like a mill wheel, slow, steady, with the occasional bright splash of laughter. At the far table, an old man tells a story about a year when the rye crop grew too quickly after a wet spring, and how some loaves from that harvest made the world shimmer at the edges. No one interrupts. They let him finish before the conversation shifts to safer topics. Historians still argue whether such tales were remembered as warnings or simply as oddities, whether people truly adjusted their baking in response or just carried on and trusted their luck. The bread on your table is half gone now, the crust growing firmer as it cools. You take another piece, break it open, and watch the steam drift upward. The crumb is dense but not heavy, the flavor deep and slightly sour, the kind that pairs well with ale's round sweetness. You imagine the grain's journey here: the field, the harvest, the mill, the oven, and finally this table in the low-lit room. The tavern keeper makes one last round, topping mugs, offering the last of the mustard, collecting empty bowls. The room hums with the sound of voices, the creak of benches, the occasional clink of a mug, set down just a little too firmly. The bread will be gone before the fire burns low, and tomorrow there will be more, though not quite like today's, because no two loaves are ever exactly the same. You finish your piece, brushing the crumbs from your fingers. The warmth from the hearth and the bread lingers in your chest, the ale in your head. Outside, the night has begun to draw its curtain, but here in the tavern, the bread and the talk will last a while yet, and with each bite, each sip, the boundary between meal and company grows softer, until they are the same thing entirely. You take the field path that runs like a seam between barley and fallow ground, your boots gathering the dust that summer leaves behind. Ahead, on a gentle rise, a windmill turns with the unhurried confidence of a creature that has learned to eat the sky. The sails creak as they pass their lowest point, cloths stretched and bellying, then ease into quiet as they climb. Wind brings its own weather to the ears today, a steady push that smells of grass and distant river. The mill's timber frame leans a hair into it, the way a respectful listener leans toward a storyteller. As you draw closer, you see that this is the older kind, a whole house that turns on a stout post, roof to floor, so the mouth of the sails can face the wind. A ladder climbs to a door set high, and beneath the body of the mill sits the great oak post like a tree stubbornly refusing to lie down. The miller's boy works the tail pole, walking it round in a patient circle, coaxing the body to present its canvas to the breeze. He pauses now and then to listen. Windmills prefer courtesy to force. Windmills like this began joining watermills centuries ago, and in places with more wind than river, they keep bread honest in dry seasons. That is the simple, everyday truth. Stones turn by air, not water. Historians still argue whether the idea sailed west from older lands where wind had long done such work, or whether people here simply looked at a turning weathercock and thought, why not let it earn its keep? The argument wanders like the wind itself, settling nowhere for long. You climb the ladder, hands dusty, and duck into the body of the mill. Inside is a world made of timber and motion. The great crosstree beams groan softly as they take the strain, and the main shaft breathes with every turn of the sails outside. A sprinkle of meal lives in the air, finer than flour, so light it seems to hesitate before deciding to fall. The smell is the good smell, you know, grain and wood only with a sharp, clean edge that wind somehow adds to everything it touches. The miller nods, points with his chin, and you understand there is no need to speak. He adjusts the shutters on the sails by a rope looped inside. More cloth for a gentler day, less when the wind grows bossy. He lifts a small wooden gate, and the hopper begins to feed grain between the stones. You watch the trickle thicken, the kernels jumping and vanishing like fish slipping through reeds. Below, the runner stone hums against the bedstone, a sound just this side of pleasant. The meal begins to spill from the spout in a pale stream, warming the wooden trough as it lands. The floor shivers with every gust. You plant your feet a little wider, as people do on boats and mills in uncertain histories. The miller reaches into the stream and rubs a pinch between finger and thumb. His thumb is broad and flattened from long habit. The miller's thumb, some call it, a tool grown out of flesh. A quirky old saying claims an honest miller's thumb is golden. Another insists the thumb is clever enough to steal a measure from every sack. Proverb making is a village pastime. Today, the thumb tells only grind and fineness. You lean to see the stones. Only their edges show most of their bodies are hidden beneath the ton and its skirts. But you can read their work by the meal's feel, by its warmth on your skin. The miller listens with a cocked head and makes the smallest lift on the tentering gear, raising the runner a whisper. The hum sweetens at once. He was listening for a note only his bones seemed to hear. Historians still argue how much of such tuning was rule and how much was craft, whether written measures guided hands or whether ears and thumbs did the teaching. You think the answer is yes to both, depending on who wrote the rules and who kept turning the wind. Through a slit in the wall, you glimpse the sails again, 4 white wings writing the same slow letter over and over on the sky. The boy outside steps to the tail pole and hauls the mill a hand's breadth to keep her square to a shifting breath. Within, gears answer with a tidy clack. The teeth are oak on oak, pegged and shaped, their faces polished by years of respectful argument. A pot of tallow sits on a beam with a goose feather poking from it. From time to time, the miller wipes a feather's worth on the cogs. Not too much, not too little, a kitchen measure for a wooden appetite. He shows you the sieve that lives below, a bolting cloth that will take the first coarser bits away when the day calls for finer flour. Mostly, though, the village likes its bread honest, bran and all. The meal pours, and you pinch again and taste the ghost of field and sun. It is almost sweet, and yet you remember that rye carries its own weather inside it, especially when harvest met rain too often. Care can watch, sort, dry, and still miss a small darkness. You say nothing, the mill says nothing. The sails keep their slow talk. On a peg hangs a string of little tokens round bits of baked clay, each scratched with a sign. Some customers leave one and take a place in the miller's remembered queue, returning later when their sacks have had their turn. The tokens look like children's game pieces or bread charms that forgot to meet dough. Quirky, practical, both. The miller flicks 2 with a dusty finger and names the owners without looking. Memory and tokens keep better order together than either alone. The boy ducks inside long enough to grin and report that the wind has found its stride. The mill answers by deepening its tone, a chest voice instead of a throat voice. The meal stream fattens and slackens with each breath from the hill. You feel it in your knees. The miller pays out a little more grain, then draws it back, matching the wind's generosity with his own caution. A hungry wind will steal your temper, a neighbor once said, meaning you must not let a lively day turn stones rash. Main facts grow patient here. Windmills have stood in these fields since your great-grandparents' time and further back, taking their share of the village's grinding when the river sulks or freezes. Their shapes differ, some all body like this, some tower still, with only the cap turning, but their work is the same. Ask the sky to push, and persuade stone to oblige. The uncertainty remains in the small things. Who first set such a body on such a post in this valley? Which winter taught which miller to shorten sail by one panel instead of two? How often a careful ear spared a pair of stones a quarrel? Historians still argue whether a certain famous mill in a certain town was the first, the best, or merely the loudest in the written record. The wind continues not to care. You kneel to tie the mouth of a filled sack. The meal's warmth comes through the cloth like a polite animal leaning against your leg. You scratch a mark on the throat with a bit of charcoal, your sign, plain as a leaf, and stack it against the wall. Another sack waits under the spout, hungry and patient. The miller lifts his chin again, listening, then eases the stones apart, a whisper more as a gust shouldered its way through the sailcloth. The hum never quite leaves pleasantness. That is his pride and his sleep. Before you go, you climb the ladder to the small hatch just beneath the roof. You push it open with your shoulder and let the wind take your hair and the meal dust both. From here the sails are closer than seems wise, canvas cracking faintly as it catches, timber sighing as it delivers. Fields lie in squares and strips beyond, stubble and green, and the river writes a slow silver sentence toward the willows. You breathe, and the mill breathes, and for a long blink you are both the same sort of creature, made to turn and to take what the day gives without argument. You climb down, thank the miller with a tilt of your head, and step back into the ladder's sunlight. Outside, the boy has wedged a stick to keep the tail pole from wandering, and is teasing a jackdaw with a braid of straw. The sails keep their letter writing, patient and repeating, and you take the path home with a sack at your shoulder, and the mill's hum still in your ears. If the bread that comes of this meal behaves, no one will think of the wind at all. If, on some unlucky night, a loaf invites the eyes to paint brighter than truth, people will mutter about weather and ovens and dreams. Historians still argue whether anyone truly read the warning in the grain before it met the stones. The wind writes no footnotes, it only turns. Lamplight finds you before you light it, as if the room has been waiting for a small sun to be born on the table. You trim the wick with a thumbnail, touch flame to flax, and watch the circle of honey-colored light swell outward until it catches the edges of bowls and baskets, a sieve, a shallow tray, and the quiet gleam of a brass scoop. Outside, evening firms into blue. Inside, the lamplight makes a world the size of your hands, which is exactly the size you need. You set the grain before you, a mix of rye and barley that spent the afternoon breathing in the shade. It looks innocent enough, hard, bright kernels with the faint sheen of good drying. You pour a modest mound onto the tray and spread it with the side of your palm. The lamp's low angle turns every contour into a little hill and shadowed valley, and in that relief map the misfits declare themselves more readily than in daylight. That is the everyday lesson of this hour. Evening is kinder to sorting. A slow rhythm grows. With your left hand you draw a narrow drift toward you. With your right hand you pluck. Pale kernels pass. Dark, shriveled fragments stop in the crook of your finger, their purple-brown gloss catching the lamplight with a slyness you do not forgive. Some are twisted like claws. Some are stubby and dull. A few resist your pinch with a rubbery give that makes your mouth pull tight. Each doubtful bit drops into a small wooden bowl to your right. Each good kernel returns to the larger basket to your left. Pluck, drop, return. The soft clack of seed against wood keeps time with your breath. This is housework, not heroism. It is as old as the first harvest that met rain at the wrong hour. Families have always picked through grain by candle, rush, and lamp. The mainstream fact is unglamorous and true. In towns, bigger stores and better-built granaries lessen the need. In villages and farms, eyes and fingers stand most of the watch. Historians still argue whether such household sorting made a real dent in danger, whether a careful lamp hour could meaningfully thin out the worst of the kernels that, under certain molds and weathers, bring burning limbs and odd visions, or whether the task comforted more than it cured. The record does not tally bowls as neatly as it tallies rents. A child pads in on bare feet and climbs onto a stool beside you, chin just high enough to clear the table. You slide the tray so that half is yours and half is his. Dark to the right, you say, and he nods with the gravity of a small clerk. His fingers are less certain but quicker. Now and then he shows you a kernel for judgment, and you let the lamp decide. Sometimes he is right by luck. Sometimes you are wrong by confidence. The bowl fills anyway. You keep a saucer of water at hand, a trick taught by a neighbor. Now and then, you flick a suspect fragment into it with your thumb. Good grain sinks fast. Airy mischief floats and spins like a beetle at the surface. It is a quirky proof, not a law, and you do not trust it alone. But it keeps the work from becoming only a duel between pride and eyesight. When the saucer grows crowded, you tip it into the small refuse pail at your feet. Then wipe its rim with a cloth worn smooth as paper. The lamp burns a little brighter where the glass is clean. You wipe it once with the corner of your sleeve and watch the light widen again. Shadows retreat from the sieve's rim. The brass scoop shines like a coin half buried in sand. Overhead, a moth taps the ceiling twice, polite knocks, then loses interest. From the hearth comes the patient pop of a log that refuses to hurry toward ash. Household sounds take turns. A spoon rests itself in a bowl. A chair decides to speak a single syllable. The cat snuffs the door gap and resigns itself to being inside. Between rounds, you rub a pinch of rye between thumb and forefinger until the husk brightens and the smell rises. Grassy, clean, a narrow sweetness like straw after sun. Then you do the same with a doubtful bit. The scent turns stale at once, faintly fungus, as if a damp cellar had learned to speak. You do not need a scholar for that distinction. Your nose collects its own definitions over years of winter and rain. Historians still argue whether noses trained like this were widespread skills or lucky households' arts. Some say mothers taught it to daughters and sons alike. Others say most people simply trusted to the miller's judgment and the baker's eye. You pause to rest your hands and stretch your neck, then take up the sieve. You pour the good kernels in and give it a gentle circle, letting small grit and dust fall into the tray below. The sound changes from clatter to hiss as fines accumulate. You lift the sieve to the lamplight, checking for any traveler you missed. One dark fleck clings near the rim, pretending to be a shadow. You tease it free with a fingernail and flick it to the bowl. The child mimics your motion without the fleck and grins at his own flourish. Lamp hours teach theater as much as they teach sorting. On the shelf above the table sits a sprig of dried rosemary tied with red thread, no practical use here, merely a house habit. You touch it once, the way you touch the door iron when passing the cellar. Quirks keep patience oiled. Beside the sprig lies a small tally stick notched with today's lamp hours. Each notch marks a bowl filled with refuse, not as a boast but as a memory against dull years when people question whether such evenings matter. If nothing else, the notches prove the night did not slip away unused. You think of other lamps in other rooms, millers mending cogs, weavers beating weft, a clerk bending over a string-bound ledger, an alewife tying her hair back before skimming a tun. The village hums in small circles tonight, each flame carving out a different square of certainty. Your circle happens to smell like grain and faint smoke. If all goes well, it will taste like ordinary bread tomorrow. The child yawns, then steadies himself with a sip of thin ale from a cup near the lamp. You trade him places. He gets the broad, easy sweep of the tray. You take the narrow edge where fragments hide. His small fingers surprise you with a good catch, 3 dark claws in a row held up like a trophy you would rather not own. You let him tip them into the bowl and say, "Right," because he is, and because naming it keeps the moment warm. A scrape at the door announces a neighbor who wants to borrow the sieve for her own lamp hour. You pass it over with a promise to collect it at dawn. Tools travel like news. They come back with other people's patience on them, smoother for the handling. Historians still argue whether such sharing meant better safety, more consistent sorting, or only neighborly feelings. The documents left behind prefer to add up fines and loaves, not favors and lamplight. You suspect favors do their work invisibly and well. When at last the bowl of refuse holds more than you hoped but less than you feared, you stop. The good kernels fill the basket to a modest, honest swell. You cover it with a cloth dampened at the edge just enough to keep the air from stealing its last softness and set it near the coolest wall. The child slides off the stool and leaves a handprint in flour on the table, as if signing a page. You leave it there a moment before brushing it smooth with the side of your hand. You snuff the lamp with a slow breath so the wick will behave tomorrow. The room shrinks back to night and window blue. In the quiet, you hold the bowl of refuse one last time. You will scatter it for the hens in the morning, or bury it where the garden keeps its forgettings. You do not call it a victory. You call it an hour that may have helped. At the door you pause. Your fingers find the latch by memory. Your mouth tastes the ghost of rye's grassy sweetness, and your shoulders carry the comfort of small work done. Tomorrow's dough will not know you were here. The oven will not care. The bread will tell no tale at the table. But sometimes the best stories are the ones that do not need to be told, because nothing odd happens after supper and no one wakes to a wall that ripples like heat. That, tonight, is reason enough for lamplight and bowls. Morning fog still clings to the hedgerows as you take the path toward the baker's door. The village smells faintly of damp earth and cooling ash. But here at the lane's bend, another scent breaks through, warm, yeasty, edged with the faint tang of scorched crust. The oven has been working since before dawn, and its breath drifts out through the open shutters in steady, invisible sighs. The bakery is little more than one wide room, with a table that runs nearly the whole length. The baker stands at the far end, forearms dusted white, hair bound back under a linen cap, loaves already baked cool on boards along the wall, their crusts crackling softly as they lose their oven heat. Nearer to you, doughs in various shapes are rising under cloths, slow mounds that shift almost imperceptibly if you watch long enough. He lifts a corner of one cloth to check the proof, pressing 2 fingers gently into the surface. The dent fills in slowly, the way a tired person straightens from a chair. "Ready," he says to no one in particular, though the boy at the table hears and nods. The boy fetches a wooden peel, its handle worn shiny by years of sliding under loaves. You step aside as the baker moves toward the great oven at the back. It is a domed structure of brick and clay, its mouth wide enough for 3 loaves across. The fire has burned low, leaving only embers banked against the sides. Heat shimmers faintly inside, the air rippling as if it remembers last night's flames. He sweeps the floor of the oven with a damp cloth tied to a long pole, the hiss of moisture turning to a brief, fragrant cloud. One by one, he loads the shaped doughs inside, working quickly so the heat doesn't wander. The boy keeps count in a quiet murmur. 5, 6, 7, until the oven is full. The peel slides under the last loaf with a small thud, then retreats. The mouth is blocked with a thick wooden door, and a wedge is tapped into place. Now comes the waiting. The baker leans against the table, arms folded, and lets his gaze drift toward the cooling loaves from the earlier batch. He picks one up, wraps the bottom with his knuckles, and listens to the hollow sound. This is a baker's commonplace, bread that sings when it's ready. You take one in your hands, surprised at how light it feels for its size, the crust firm beneath your palms. You resist the urge to tear it open. This one is meant for a customer, not for curiosity. Historians still argue whether communal ovens like this truly reduced the risks of bad grain, or whether they simply concentrated whatever was in the flour into a shared batch. In towns, records show fines for bakers whose loaves were too light or whose flour was judged spoiled. In villages, such judgments were often left to gossip and custom. The truth is somewhere between. A baker's reputation lived in the mouths of his neighbors as surely as in the bread itself. The boy starts clearing the table, brushing loose flour into a small heap and scraping away the bits of dough stuck near the edges. He pauses now and then to sniff at his fingers, as if the smell of yeast and grain might reveal a secret. You help by lifting the boards of cooled loaves and setting them closer to the front, where customers can reach them when the door opens. The crusts are not uniform, some darker, some lighter, but all have that faint bloom of flour on the surface, a reminder of the hands that shaped them. When the oven door is pulled open again, a wave of heat rolls out, carrying the smell that makes people pause in the lane. The baker works quickly, sliding each loaf onto the peel and setting it on the cooling boards. Steam escapes in narrow wisps from the ends of the crusts. The sound is almost like rain beginning on a warm roof. He taps each loaf once, nodding at the sound, satisfied. One loaf looks a little different, its crust darker in patches, its shape slightly slumped. The baker frowns and sets it apart from the others. He will taste that one first, perhaps feed it to the pigs if it seems odd. Bread is too precious to waste outright, but not precious enough to risk at the table if something is wrong. You can see him weighing the choice in his mind, the balance between thrift and safety. Historians still argue whether medieval bakers had any real means to detect certain hidden troubles, or whether they simply relied on experience and the occasional warning from a customer. The customers arrive in twos and threes, carrying cloths or baskets. They greet the baker, choose their loaves, and exchange a few words before heading off down the lane. Payment is in coin for some, in grain or eggs for others. The boy wraps loaves in cloth for those who ask, tucking the ends neatly as if they were gifts. The line moves slowly, but no one complains. The smell is company enough while they wait. When your turn comes, the baker hands you 2 loaves, still warm enough to make your fingers shift. You cradle them against your chest, feeling the heat soak through your tunic. Outside, the morning is brighter now, the fog lifting to show the fields beyond the village. You take the path home, the bread scent following you like a small, good wind. The loaves will cool on your table before supper. By then, the crust will have firmed and the crumb will be ready to slice. You will break one open with the heel of your hand, listening for that soft sigh of steam. And if the bread tastes as it should, grain and fire and nothing strange, you will think no more of the baker's frown or the loaf he set aside. Bread, after all, is meant to be ordinary, and ordinary is a gift that arrives fresh each morning, warm from the oven. You carry the new loaves to the long bench by the window, where reed mats lie waiting like woven fields. The reeds are pale and dry, their thin stems flattened and stitched into wide squares that whisper when you set the bread down. Each loaf takes its place with a soft rustle. The hot bottoms meet the cool reeds, and the room changes at once. Steam unspools from the crusts in silver threads, and the air fills with a smell that is both sharp and mellow hot grain, easing itself toward rest. The loaves begin to talk, not with words, but with the settling music bakers know. A series of tiny crackles and pops as the crusts tighten and then ease, as if they are remembering the heat and choosing to keep only the part they liked. You lean close without touching. The sound flickers along the bench like small sparks finding each other. A cat hears it too and blinks, unimpressed, then circles twice on a folded cloth and settles into the posture that says it intends to supervise cooling. Cooling on reeds is the ordinary way here, as common as smoke finding the eaves. Mats and latticed racks keep heat from sweating too long against the crust, and the pattern they press is a familiar badge crosshatching or simple lines, a quiet proof that the loaf met air as well as fire. That is the plain fact of village bread, the kind you could bet a morning on. Stones to bake, reeds to cool. You run a thumb along the mat's edge and feel where years of loaves have polished the reeds smooth. You turn each round a finger's breadth so the steam escapes evenly. Where a loaf touched the peel, a faint crescent shows. You face those crescents toward the breeze slipping through the open shutter. The boy at your elbow does the same, serious as a scribe aligning letters. He taps one loaf with a knuckle and grins at the hollow answer. Tapping is a habit that survives every season, the quick test for a baked heart. The cat lifts one ear at the sound and returns to not caring. A fly lands, bold with morning, and you lift a sprig of rosemary from a jar of water to fan it away. The sprig's scent wanders over the bench and folds itself into the warm bread smell until the two are hard to tell apart. A quirky house rule says rosemary persuades flies to mind manners. Perhaps it does. Perhaps it merely pleases humans. Either way, the sprig belongs here, near the reed mats, where it can pretend to be both charm and tool. One loaf wears a deeper seam along its score, the cut having opened like a calm mouth in the heat. Another shows a little blister, a tiny, glossy bubble where the crust rose faster than the crumb. You slide that one to the edge so it cools first. Someone will want it before patience has had a chance to teach wisdom. You listen again to the murmuring crusts. A story passed from baker to baker says a good loaf sings as it cools, and you have never known a baker who did not hold a round to an ear at least once, partly for truth, partly for joy. You lift a loaf gently and look beneath. The mat has tattooed it with a faint grid, proof that air has gotten under and done its work. Bread set on plain boards cools more slowly. Bread set on stone cools too quickly and grows sulky. Reeds and woven willow know how to be kind to heat. Historians still argue whether mats like these were found in every village, or whether some places favored slatted wooden frames and rope wound racks. The evidence sits in pictures, mentions, and a few blessed scraps, none of them eager to settle the matter for good. You decide as usual that tools followed what the countryside could spare. Reeds by marshes, willow by streams, smooth rods where carpenters were generous. On the bench's far end rests the baker's testing loaf from the last firing, already broken. He pinches a bit of its crumb and chews thoughtfully, eyes half closed. You do the same with a small piece from the heel. The crumb is even, damp only with its own steam. The taste a slow ladder, grain first, then sweetness, then a shadow, bitter that keeps you interested without becoming a scold. Nothing odd stirs behind the flavors. The loaf behaves like a well-taught guest. You exhale a little, a breath you didn't know you were holding. You arrange the bench into gentle order, darker rounds nearer the draft, paler loaves a step away, festival breads at the center where the scented steam can tease passers-by. The boy drags a reed mat a finger to the left, not because it matters, but because the straight line pleases him. A neighbor appears in the doorway, breathless with an errand, and stops there a heartbeat longer than manners require, eyes on the bench, nose at full attention. Cooling bread changes how people stand. It slows the feet that came to fetch something else and sends them away with bread tucked under the arm and their original errand a distant second. A bit of talk travels with the steam. Someone mentions the cellar's damper smell last week. Someone else says the granary's slits have been opened earlier each morning. These are not accusations, only notes sung to keep time with the season. You think of the lamplight sorting you did last night, the bowl of doubtful bits now buried beneath the far fence, the small confidence that begins in such bowls and ends in such benches. The lifetimes of caution between field and mouth rarely get speeches. They get reed mats and quiet nods. A cracked crust catches the light, and you lay 2 fingers lightly across it, as if to smooth it, though the bread needs no smoothing from you. Your fingertips read its story anyway. The quick lift near the score, the grain's coarser flecks where the knife met bran, the tiny ridge where the oven floor's heat rose hottest. You leave your hand there a moment longer than necessary, like a guest reluctant to rise from a chair that fits. The boy returns with a shallow tray of clean cloths. Together you tent the loaves that cooled first, laying linen over them so the last of the steam does not escape rudely. Bread that cools too naked to cold air grows brittle and complains at slicing. Bread that cools smothered scolds back with a leathery crust. The cloth is the middle way. A grandmother once said, "Bread likes company even when it rests." And she meant cloth, hands, the presence of someone listening for the last crackle. You set aside one round that baked slightly darker than its fellows. The baker will keep it near the cat's warm patch and cut it as soon as he pretends not to be hungry. Another loaf, shaped long for a neighbor with a large pot of broth, gets its own cloth so it does not pick up the coriander breath of the festival breads. The room keeps small promises like that, and the loaves seem to approve, though loaves approve by being themselves and no more. For a long moment, everyone leaves the bench alone. The cat dreams with one paw over its nose. The breeze changes its mind and slips in from the other shutter. A sparrow lands on the sill, dares a single hop, then reconsiders the wisdom of a room ruled by a cat and leaves. The crackling fades to the occasional faint click, the sound of cooling finishing its sentences. You lift one round and feel that it has chosen a new weight, lighter now that steam has gone to join the sunlight. You and the boy rub the mats with your palms to shake loose the flour that settled in their seams. It falls like fine snow, making ghosts on the boards. You roll each mat and set it upright in the corner so the next batch can meet clean reeds. Your hands smell of hot crust, dry reed, and rosemary. It is a scent that sits on the tongue as much as in the nose, the kind that becomes part of your idea of afternoon. By the time you tie 2 loaves with straw for carrying, the bench is quieted. The patterns on the bottoms have set, the crusts have learned their new firmness, and the crumbs inside have finished their gentle settling. If someone tapped a loaf now, the answer would be more hollow, the drum clearer. You do not tap. You simply gather what the bench offers. Warmth becoming memory, scent becoming story, bread becoming the kind of ordinary that a day leans on without noticing. You open the door and let the cool edge of outside brush the room. The loaves do not mind. They have passed from fire to air and kept their shape. You glance back once more at the reed mats, empty for a breath and then occupied again as the next peal arrives. The work does not end. It narrows to the size of a crust cooling well. You carry 2 rounds against your hip and step into the lane, the last soft click from the bench following you like a friendly closing eye. You hear it before you mean to, a low thread of talk that runs under the day like water under turf. 2 men stand near the well with their shoulders closed, the bucket rope creaking between them as if it, too, wishes to listen. You slow without quite stopping. The word that keeps returning is the one everyone understands but prefers to keep folded away: ill bread. Not bad bread, not stale bread, not bread baked too hot. Ill bread, the kind that makes the tongue forget its business, or the eyes paint light where there is only dusk. They speak of a neighbor who woke after supper and could not tell the difference between the chair and the shadow of the chair. In the small hours he swore the hearth's orange coals were a saint's procession climbing the wall. By dawn his hands burned without flame. The story is told without any hunger for wonder. It leaks out like rain finding the same crack again. You do not move closer. You let the words cross the lane to you, as if they belong to everyone a little. There is a plain, everyday fact that even careful voices accept. Certain seasons turn rye into a doubtful friend. When the harvest wears too much rain, when the air sits heavy, and the field answers too quickly, loaves sometimes carry a heat that does not belong to fire. In some places they call it saint's fire, or the burning, an illness that grips limbs with cramps and scalds the skin from within. In other places, the talk leans toward visions and bright noises that do not stop when lids are closed. Pilgrims travel to shrines with pig bells, and hospitals bearing the name of a certain saint take them in. That is the fact, shorn of tidy cause. Historians still argue whether people standing at wells like this named the grain as the culprit with any certainty, or whether they blamed the oven, the ale, the season's air, the displeasure of a saint, or a fever without lineage. Some say the link between rye and burning nights was old news in villages, learned by sore experience and passed along with harvest gossip. Others say the connection belonged mainly to learned mouths, written in books far from fields. The truth shifts its weight. Some years the finger points to sacks, some years it points to luck. The 2 men trade measures. One says he saw a loaf from the same sack sliced at a different table that caused nothing more than heavy sleep. The other says a widow once threw damp rye into her poultry yard and woke to hens that walked as if the earth remembered a storm. You have heard that last tale before, told in a tone that manages to be both warning and entertainment. You do not know if it is true. You know only that stories keep their shape when they are useful. A woman with a blue scarf joins them and adds a detail about a charm against hot loaves. A sprig of St. John's wort, stitched into the edge of the breadcloth on midsummer, then kept there through the first frost. Bread likes to be reminded of days that behave, she says, half smiling as if daring someone to call it foolish. Quirky as it is, the charm travels well. You have seen the yellow-dried flowers hanging in doorways, and you have seen the way people pretend not to touch them when they pass. You draw water into your own small pail and watch the surface settle. Your face wavers there, then steadies, then wavers again in a breeze that belongs to the well alone. Across the square, a cart tips sacks toward the mill, and dust lifts like a blessing that forgot its words. The ordinary hum continues. A child disputes a cat's opinion. A spinner shakes her distaff free of a tangle. Someone laughs at something no one will remember in an hour. Over all of it hangs the soft, unremarkable smell of fresh bread from a house that lives nearest the oven. The talk at the well lowers. You hear the name of a shrine downriver, where people walk when limbs burn and fingers curl, a church that keeps a wooden pig carved above its door, and a bell rope worn thin by hands that beg for cooling. The bell's sound is said to soften the nights and make bread behave for a time when brought home under one arm. You have never gone. You have met travelers who have and who say the bell's echo follows them into their kitchens for a month. Whether echo changes flour or only minds, you cannot know, but you honor the walking it asks. One of the men lifts his palms, both sound, both steady, and says that this year will likely pass without such journeys if people keep to careful habits. Grain dried on cloth in proper sun, sacks turned, cellars aired, sieves worked by lamplight, doubtful kernels fed to hens or buried. The other answers that care is a short blanket in a long winter. He does not say it unkindly. He He says it as someone who has watched rain do arithmetic that people cannot undo with neatness. You carry your water home and set the pail by the hearth. The room smells of cooling loaves. The reed mats have imprinted their pattern on the day. You break a heel from a round that has learned its quiet and taste what you always hope to taste. Field, fire, patience, nothing else. The crumb is soft without being damp. The crust answers with a small, polite crack when you press it. No light skitter in the edge of your sight. No heat crawls into your fingers. You keep chewing and allow yourself the small relief of a nod no one can see. Still, the talk clings the way flour clings to cuffs. You think of the lamplight you burned the night before, the bowl that filled with purple-brown shards shaped like claws, the small grave you gave them under the hedge. You think of the baker's frown at one loaf that looked a little strange, the way he set it aside rather than trust it to a stranger's table. These are the quiet defenses the village makes without speeches. An extra hour at the sieve, a nose bent longer over a sack, a loaf lost on purpose. They do not promise certainty. They promise a kind of companionship with risk. A scrap of memory wanders in from childhood, an aunt who charred the outer slice of a doubtful loaf until it was near black, then crumbled it into broth to smoke out whatever sat wrong. You have never tried it. You have heard other kitchen physics as well, salt scattered in a circle around the breadboard, the first cut made crosswise to teach the crumb humility, the heel tossed into the hearth as an offering to the household's luck. Quirks may not heat ovens or dry grain, but they give hands something to do when waiting is the only tool left. Dusk leans against the windows. You take a cup to the door and look toward the line of willows that hides the river. Somewhere beyond them, someone is, at this very moment, tasting a loaf that will either quiet the day or stir it. Your own loaf finishes cooling like a cat growing sure of its nap. The talk at the well has already blown into other corners onions, a cracked wheel, the blush on a neighbor's face when a certain name was said too loudly. Villages prefer to close the book on trouble by turning the page. Historians still argue whether communities like this kept a private ledger, grain fields on one side, bad nights on the other, learning, year by year, to distrust certain strips of soil or certain barns. Some say households knew perfectly well which sacks to treat like a sleeping dog and learned to make porridge and ale when they dared not make bread. Others insist the notes were too scattered, the memories too local, the courage too thin when hunger pressed. You listen to both arguments and hear in them the same undertone that hums beneath the well's rope. Care tries, seasons decide. You close the door and slice the loaf for supper. The knife moves cleanly. The slices fall in gentle order, each one laying a crescent of steam on the board before the room welcomes it. You set a small dish of salt by the heel, a piece of cheese beside the plate, and a sprig of something green for the nose to find. You sit, you chew. You keep your eyes on the ordinary, on the way the crust roughens your thumb, on the way the crumb gives and then remembers itself, on the way the room stays put around you. If the night passes with its usual shadows, you will think of the well only in the morning when you lift the pail again. If a flicker comes a brightness that does not belong, you will remember the men's voices and the bell down river and the bowl you buried. For now, the bread behaves, which is as much as anyone in a village has ever asked of it. You tear another piece, dip it into salt, and let the day finish on your tongue without argument. You find the miller standing in the doorway of his house like a weather vane that has learned to speak. Evening lays a thin shine on the river, and the wheel turns slower now, wings heavy with the day. He has a sieve in one hand and a scoop in the other, and his boots are powdered white up to the laces. When he sees you, he tilts the scoop so a small slide of rye kernels travels from wood to palm, then back again, a dry whisper that sounds like caution practicing its lines. He does not begin with stories. He begins with smell. He unties a sack, buries his nose to the cloth, and inhales in the steady way of someone who once trusted a quick breath and paid for it. Dry, clean, he says, meaning this one. The next sack receives a longer pause. River weak, he says of that one, meaning rain and swollen banks and mist that gnawed at ears of grain while they were still standing. You lean close and catch the difference. The first, a field remembered. The second, a cellar imagining itself. He pours a measure into the sieve and sets you both to the small, familiar shaking. Darker shards gather quickly at the edge, a handful of shriveled, purple-brown claws that do not roll like honest seed. He lifts one to the light. "Trouble," he says, the word shaped like a nail set gently on a beam. He flicks it to a bowl that already holds a mean little harvest. "Not much," he adds, and that "not" is the day's mercy. Millers are the village's second weather, as ordinary a fact as the wheel itself. They red grain with fingers, ears, and temper, then tune the stones to suit, raising the runner with the tentering gear by a whisper when rye is gritty dry, lowering it when barley arrives, softer from a kind summer. They take their toll too, a lawful handful for their service called multure in some places, the breath tax of bread's journey. That much is simple and settled, like the wheel's wet turning. He shows you his thumb, the broad pad rubbed keen by a lifetime of meal. With it, he tests for moisture, crushing a kernel and feeling the give. A good berry breaks and remembers to be dry, he says. A wet one only sulks. He bites one in half and chews. His jaw decides before his tongue does. A quirky habit rides beside the test. He keeps a strip of wool tucked into his belt and sometimes rolls meal into it. If the meal clings in a damp cake instead of dusting off, he swears the stones should wait. You smile at the wool, and he smiles back, daring you to laugh and failing to hide his pride in the trick. The wheel thumps softly beyond the wall. He leads you inside where the great stones mumble. Dust keeps the windows honest and the sun humble. Light travels here with a hat in its hand. He pulls a small lever, and the stones sigh apart a fraction care, drawn into wood and iron. Damp rye wants a higher kiss, he says, meaning distance that spares heat and crush. Too tight and you make paste instead of meal, and paste turns sullen in the oven. He opens his palm and lets a pinch of fresh ground fall. It is warm, almost sweet on the skin, but you can feel how quickly warmth might turn to cloy in the wrong weather. "Listen," he says, and you do. The sound the stones make today is a calm hum, no grit cry, no bark. "Hear that?" he asks. And you nod even if you are more reading his shoulders than the tone. If it rasps, I lift. If it sings flat, I lower. If it purrs, I leave it be. He says it like a prayer he didn't intend to learn but has said long enough to trust. He gestures toward a small shelf by the hopper. On it sit 3 clay tokens, each scratched with a mark you've seen on sacks and loaves and field stakes. "These are today's doubtfuls," he says. "From the low strip beside the willow, I'll grind them last. I'll tell the households to make porridge and ale and leave the oven out of that conversation. You think of how many cautions move through villages without ever becoming edicts, suggestions carried by eyebrows, nudges, and the order in which sacks are emptied. Historians still argue whether millers like him separated dangerous grain with any consistency, whether their noses and thumbs were hedge enough between fields and fever, or whether care only narrowed the odds and luck wrote most of the story. Some say millers were blamed too quickly for burned hands and bright nights because their faces were easiest to find when bread misbehaved. Others say the best of them learned the river's habits and the harvest's moods well enough to make a real difference. The records are heavy for fines and light for evenings saved. He lifts the lid on a small chest near the door. Inside lies a short row of bent nails, a coin hammered thin, and a little wooden pig rubbed smooth by years of pockets. "From my father," he says of the pig, and does not explain. He keeps the coin under the threshold of the stone's frame. "For luck and balance," he says, a house quirk that repairs nothing but courage. The bent nails he drives into the door lintel when the river overspeaks, to remind the rain it has work of its own. You do not ask questions. In mills, as in ovens, small superstitions lay thin blankets over large uncertainties. He pulls a bag of sand from the wall and pours a ribbon of it over the runner stone, then wipes it away with a tuft of straw. The sand polishes a breath's worth of face from the stone, keeping the grind even. He taps the edge with a mallet, listening. You hear a note change but cannot name it. He nods as if the stone has apologized for a thoughtless moment. "You'll tell them?" he asks, meaning the families whose sacks smelled like river. "You say you will. Tell them to lay the grain thin on cloth in the yard for 2 days. Turn it with a slotted spoon. Listen for the sound of dryness. Good grain falls like sand. Bad grain lands like a cat with wet feet. The picture is so precise you almost laugh. And then you do, softly. He grins. And if the smell argues, let the hens hold court. And he pours the bowl of purple-brown claws into a separate sack, ties it twice, marks it with a chalk cross, and sets it by the back door where the sun can find it but the kitchen cannot. Garden corner, he says. Deep. The gesture is firm and ordinary, itself a kind of Miller's homily. Do not invite what you cannot feed safely. Outside, the wheel drips a little silver back into the river as it turns. He pulls the sluice a notch and the hum quickens, then settles where he wants it. There are years when caution is half the loaf, he says, voice like a hand on a shoulder. You think of the cat who sleeps on the reed mats, of rosemary by a bench, of lamp hours and well talk, and the way rumor and wisdom braid themselves until neither can be pulled free. He walks you to the door and hands you a small muslin bag tied with twine. From the high strip, he says. Stone kept honest for it. Tell them to bake with the windows open and the cat awake. You promise. He lifts 2 fingers at the wheel, as if thanking a mule for a good day's walk. As you step into the lane, the mill's damp breath meets the last warm sigh from the bakery you left an hour ago. The 2 smells fold into each other the way caution and hunger do never quite separate, never quite the same. You heft the muslin bag and listen. It answers with the quiet that clean grain makes, the sound of dry sand agreeing to be meal. Behind you, the miller closes his door with the careful softness of a man who knows every hinge and still prefers not to startle them. Down the path, you pass a girl rolling a hoop and a boy throwing a stick for a patient dog. The dog trots back with the stick in its mouth, and the dog's eyes say, as clearly as any miller's voice, again, but watch where you throw. You smile without meaning to. The village has learned 1,000 ways to say the same small caution. You carry one of them home in a bag that looks insignificant and weighs exactly what a careful evening should. You return home to find the baker bent over the bench, a small candle guttering in the draft from the half-latched shutter. His elbows are planted like hinges, his hands busy with a shallow wooden tray filled with grain that shivers whenever his fingers pass through it. He is sorting again despite the hour, pulling away kernels that glint wrong or smell faintly of rain trapped too long in straw. The candlelight makes the shadows of his fingers into long, thin hooks that seem to keep working even when he pauses. You ease into the room quietly. The loaf you brought from the mill's high strip sits cooling on the far corner of the bench, set apart from the day's baking, as if its journey from field to sack to stone has earned it a clean berth. On the table beside the tray lies a neat little pile of what will never reach an oven. Purple-brown slivers curled like claws, a few speckled bits that look harmless until the nose confirms otherwise. He pushes them toward a clay pot already half full. This is the evening's mischief, he says without looking up. The word mischief rolls out without heat, like the name of a pet that has strayed again but is still expected home. You take up another tray and sit across from him, mimicking his motions. The plain fact is that this slow sorting by hand, by lamplight or candle, is as old as bread itself. Sieves and winnows carry the first burden, but fingers carry the last. Good grain flows like dry sand. Bad grain catches, clumps, or gives off a scent that seems to lean away from you. The trick, if there is one, is to trust your senses even when the difference is small enough to hide in shadows. Historians still argue whether such nightly rituals were truly common in every medieval household, or only in those with the time and light to spare. Some point to account rolls in household manuals that mention evening grain cleaning as routine. Others note that candles cost dear and oil dearer, making late days sorting an occasional chore rather than a nightly rite. The evidence is like a sack half filled, heavy enough to know it's there, too light to say exactly how it got that way. The baker tips his head toward the clay pot. Old Rena says to keep the pot lidded, else the smell will climb the walls and sour the rafters. He says it with a small smile, knowing Rena's advice is only half serious. Still, he sets the lid in place as if to humor the idea. Quirky habits in kitchens multiply like sparrows. Each one may have started in reason, but most stay because hands remember them better than minds do. A mouse skitters along the far shelf, keeping to the edge where shadows fold themselves into comfort. The baker glances at it, then at the cat curled by the hearth. She's on holiday, he says dryly, and the cat does not bother to disagree. You flick a kernel toward the mouse's path, more out of reflex than charity, and the little creature vanishes into a crack before the gift lands. Your fingers find a kernel with a pale fuzz clinging to its tip. You pinch it away, roll the grain between thumb and forefinger, then drop it into the pot. "River week," you say, echoing the miller. The baker nods. River week is a busy one for this pot. He pushes another claw-shaped shard across the tray. Some years, the pot is barely worth lidding. This year, it could keep a stew warm. He pauses to stretch his shoulders, the joints in his spine sounding faintly like dry reeds. "When I was a boy," he says, "my mother would take the pot out behind the hedge, dig a hole as deep as her forearm, and empty it there. She'd spit once into the hole before covering it. Said it gave the earth a reason to keep the trouble buried." You nod, having heard similar rituals with salt, ash, or even a scrap of bread crust burned black. The candle dips, wax pooling in the saucer. You can feel the warmth of the flame on your knuckles as you work. Grain sorting has its own rhythm. A pinch, a roll, a sniff, a decision. Bad kernels clink faintly into the pot. Good ones sigh back into the tray. The sound, low and steady, could put a listener to sleep if they were not bent over the work themselves. Outside, the lane has settled into the hush between the last clatter of pails and the first call of the night watch. You imagine other houses with other hands doing the same thing. Some with better light, some with none at all, some with only the morning sun to catch what the eye can. The village's safety is built grain by grain, finger by finger, without banners or bells. The baker leans back and studies the pot. "Enough," he says, though you can see there are more kernels waiting. Enough means the lamp oil is low, or the hour is near the point where the mind slips and lets a bad one pass. Enough means trusting that what's left will behave. He sets the pot by the door for burying in the morning, next to a bundle of rosemary meant for the bench. He takes the high-strip loaf from the corner and places it between you. The crust is cool now, firm under the knife. He cuts it open, and the crumb offers its clean, sweet smell like a guest who has remembered to wash before supper. No odd colors mar the slice. No heat rises that doesn't belong to baking. You each take a piece, dipping it into a pinch of salt on the table. "Good bread," he says simply, and you agree. The loaf's weight in the hand feels honest, its bite even and calm. Outside, the wind noses at the shutter, but the candle's flame stays steady. You chew slowly, aware that every bite is a small vote in favor of the day's careful work. When the bread is gone, the baker brushes the crumbs into his palm and scatters them into the hearth's coals. "For the fire," he says, as if the flames too have earned their due. The cat opens one eye to watch, then closes it again. The mouse does not return. You stand, stretch, and feel the grain dust drift from your sleeves. The pot waits by the door, the lid snug, holding the day's trouble like a story that won't be told aloud. Tomorrow it will join the others under the hedge, where earth and spit will keep it company. Tonight it is enough to know the bread on the table behaves. The candle burns true, and the quiet in the lane is the ordinary kind. You arrive before the bells finish their first bright sentence, when the square smells of damp stone and the shy spice of early fires. The baker's board is not the usual republic of round loaves. Today the table is a garden. Birds with folded wings, coils that suggest vines, plaited crowns, and small sheaves tied in dough, ribbons that remember the field. Steam rises from them in gentle threads, as if the shapes were still breathing the idea that made them. You stand very still, because standing still is how you taste with your eyes first. He sets a new tray down and lifts the cloth. The bird loaves were cut with 2 quick strokes at the tail, then twisted to a neat fork. The beak was pinched with flour, dry fingers. The eye is a single clove, pressed just far enough to look thoughtful. The vine coils were rolled long on the board, braided once, then circled into a nest with a leaf scored at the meeting place. There is honey in these, just a thumb of it, and a pinch of seed that waits to be discovered by the nose before the tongue. This is feast bread ordinary dough, taught manners for a special hour. In many towns and villages, feast days have always asked the oven to play along. That is the everyday fact. Loaves shaped and marked for saints and seasons, blessed in doorways, carried in baskets that smell of willow and clean cloth. Some families bring their own molds, carved boards with shallow birds and flowers, and press the tops of the loaves before baking, so the pattern will last through the heat like a memory that refuses to fade. Guild houses in larger places keep official molds too. The wood dark with years of buttering, the edges softened by many mornings, just like this one. The baker works with a quiet pride that straightens his back. He rolls a length of dough under both palms until it narrows at the ends, then ties it in a simple knot and tucks the tails beneath. For little hands, he says, meaning children who will not wait for a slice, but will accept a knot as a whole. He dusts a board with flour and shows you how the birds were made. 2 snips for a tail, a press for the beak, a crease down the back to suggest a wing. The motion is quick, thoughtful, and unshowy, like good pen strokes in a plain letter. A basket of saffron sits near the hearth. Not much of it, threads like red hair, dear enough to stir quiet math behind the brow. He pinches a few into warm water, and the liquid turns the color of afternoon. Some of the bird loaves will take this water, so their bellies bake the soft gold that makes neighbors stop with a soft noise in the throat. Historians still argue whether spice and feast bread spread outward from rich tables, or whether village ovens claimed the habit on their own whenever a trader's pouch shed a few threads and seeds. The record nods at both stories, and then goes back to counting rents. A girl appears with a bundle of thin stick flags wrapped in cloth paper-thin scraps, stiffened with a wash of flour paste, each tied to a skewer. The baker lets her set one above the beak of every third bird, a small bright pennant that will tremble when carried. It is a quirky local pleasure. Flying loaves, the children call them, though everyone knows breads prefer perches. Whether the custom began here or wandered in from a fair years ago, no one remembers, but it keeps returning as surely as the bells. On a small sideboard rest the plaited crowns. He made them from 3 strands each, pinched together at one end and woven with a rhythm that makes the dough look like hair. Before they went to the oven, he pressed a ring of crushed coriander on the tops so the crowns would breathe a little garden into the square when they cooled. He points to one and says it is meant for the bell ringers to share after the last peal, a payment that tastes better than coin in a pocket. You watch his hands as he lifts the next batch to the peel. Each shape needs a different kindness from the fire. Birds are set where the heat is moderate, so their beaks do not brown into scowls. Vines go deeper, where a quicker crust will keep their circles from relaxing into puddles. He tosses a splash of water against the dome to give the birds room to rise before the crust closes over their breath. The oven answers with a soft hiss that sounds very much like approval. While they bake, he tells you about a loaf shaped like a key that some households ask for on certain days, a reminder of gates hoped to open or of doors kept safely shut. He makes the key by flattening a small pat of dough for the head and notching the end with a knife, then laying the stem across the top with a pinch to keep it from wandering. Historians still argue how widely such shapes traveled, and whether their meanings were steady or changed with every river crossing. A dove here might be a lark there. A key in one valley might be a fish in another. The loaves did not write down their reasons. They only tasted right when they were eaten in company that knew them. The oven door opens and a bright low heat reaches your cheeks. The birds shine where they sprung. Their backs crackled just a little along the scored line. The crowns took color kindly, the vines kept their circles, the leaf cuts now thin shadows. He sets them to cool on reed mats, and the room becomes briefly too fragrant for speech grain, honey, and the sharp, sweet breath of seed. A child presses both hands to her cheeks, as if to keep herself from crying from the happiness of the smell. You notice little acts of caution tucked inside the celebration. A tray off to one side holds 2 loaves from a sack the miller had called River Week. The baker marked their bottoms with a single extra slash and will taste them before any leave the room. He taps each with a knuckle, listens, and sets them near the open window so the breeze can offer an opinion. Feast does not excuse forgetting. A woman arrives with a cloth-covered basket and asks for 4 birds and 1 crown. The baker chooses the ones with the neatest beaks, settles them into the basket, and tucks the cloth back so the eyes peep. The woman laughs at being watched by bread. Behind her, a boy points at the key loaf on the sideboard and whispers that he wants the door that goes with it. The baker tells him the door appears only when the loaf is shared with someone you did not plan to share it with. The boy nods, as if this is the sort of condition keys always set. You turn one of the vine loaves and see where the reed mat has kissed its back with a faint crisscross, a pattern that will make a quiet surprise at the feast table when a curious finger flips it over. The birds cool first, their small bodies losing heat quickly, and the paper pennants stir when anyone passes, as if the loaves were noticing with polite interest. You lift one and feel its lightness, the way celebration often feels light, even when it took heavy work to prepare. The bells begin again, shorter now, the last call before processions and benches, and slow dances that look like walking. The baker wipes his hands on a cloth and ties the spice pouch tighter, a habit of closing the day's spending. He sets aside a knot loaf for a child who brings him news from the well, another for the old man who oils the oven's hinge without being asked. You watch him count generosity the way he counts flour, measure by measure, not all at once. You will carry 2 birds home, a crown for neighbors, and a vine for the board at the end of the lane. You will tear them with your hands, so the cut does not interrupt the shape too severely. And you will notice, with that small childish joy that never truly leaves, that a bird's tail makes 2 perfect handles for sharing. Whether these shapes mean exactly what the elders say, or whether they mean only that the oven remembered joy today, remains a question for people who do not have honey on their fingers. Historians still argue whether such breads taught belief or simply dressed hunger in a finer coat. You decide not to decide. As you step into the square, steam lifts from the basket like a banner. The birds point their beaks toward the bells. The crowns rest together as if they had always been one. The air smells like a promise kept. And you walk slowly, because slow walking is how a feast begins, careful not to let the pennants tangle, steady enough to keep the warm shapes whole until the table can do what tables do best. Supper is plain and kind. You cut the loaf with a good knife and lay the slices on a wooden plate, each one still remembering the oven. A pot of greens sits beside a crust of cheese, and a pinch of salt keeps them honest. You eat without ceremony, as most evenings ask you to do bread, then greens, then bread again to carry the last of the pot's juices. The room is gentle. Rushlight low, door pushed to, cat testing the warmest square of floor with its paw before agreeing to lie down. When the plate is wiped clean by the last heel, your tongue holds the taste you trust grain, a whisper of sour, the quiet ash ghost of yesterday's fire. You breathe once into your hands, as if warming them at a memory. Later, you bank the coals and lay a stick across them to keep them from sulking. You fold the cloth over the remaining loaf, smoothing it the way you smooth a child's hair when you wish for a dreamless night. A small house habit intrudes one you took from an aunt. You turn the loaf so its scored sign faces the wall. Bread needn't watch people sleep, she would say, half laughing. Quirky wisdom clings to kitchens like steam to rafters. You keep it because it costs nothing and sometimes buys you a better mood. You lie down. The bed greets you with the straw's modest crackle, the blanket with its wool weight that turns into comfort only after a minute of shifting. The cat rearranges itself against your calf and purrs an answer to a question you did not ask. You close your eyes, and the day, which had carried more sorting than talk, begins to loosen its fingers. Sleep comes in the soft, creaky way of old stairs. Somewhere between waking and sleep, you hear the loaf on the bench make the tiniest sound a click. A settling, the last word of cooling that forgot to finish earlier. The sound arrives through the shut door, which is, of course, impossible, and you smile at your own foolishness inside the smile you make in dreams. Then, the dream widens. The bench grows longer than the room can hold, the reed mats turning into plowed strips of field, neat as combed hair. Loaves stand on them like small hills with warm hearts. When you touch one, it opens like a hand, and inside there is nothing but good heat and a smell like the hour after harvest when the wagons come home and the dogs pretend to be guard dogs. The dream drifts to the mill, and the mill turns slower than time, its sails made of linen napkins that flap to dry above a stream. A heron carries a peel on its shoulder and steps solemnly as though it has all the rights of a baker. In dreams, you accept this. The heron's eye is bright and ordinary. It blinks in that sideways way that birds have, then nods at you with the courtesy of someone showing you how to place a loaf so it finds its best heat. You nod back because your manners have crossed into sleep along with you, and it would be a shame to send them out again to fetch themselves in the dark. At the edge of the dream, color grows a little too clean. Shadows move as if the room were breathing with a second pair of lungs. You do not sit up. You simply note that the reed pattern on the loaf's bottom would make a good path if you were small as a beetle. And then you are that small for the space of a heartbeat crossing the grid of browned lines, carrying a crumb on your back like a pilgrim's stone. The crumb is light. The path is short. The bench is a plain, wooden country, worth crossing. There is an everyday fact, even here where the dream makes itself at home. People in many valleys have long told of nights after certain loaves, when the world's edges look as if a thin lace had been pinned there, beautiful, not frightening, too bright to belong to the hour. They speak also of other nights when hands burn and feet cramp and fingers do not mind their master, a sickness known in many tongues as the burning or saint's fire. Pilgrims walked to certain houses of care where a saint's sign hung over the door, and those houses fed them and cooled them, and sometimes the burning went away. The records of such places are thick with names and thin on sure causes, but the fact of them stands as stone stands. Historians still argue whether people in kitchens like yours believed the gentler brightness and the harsher burning were cousins from the same field born of rye that kept too much rain, or whether they were counted as different beasts entirely. One a traveling fever, one a trick of a weary spirit, one a punishment with a bell-rope cure. Some say villages knew the grain was guilty when the season ran wet and the sacks grew stubborn. Others say the knowing belonged mostly to later pens that loved linking cause to tale. The argument keeps its voice down, as scholars try to do when a household is sleeping. You sleep on. The dream returns to safer ground. A festival loaf shaped like a bird perches on the window ledge and knocks once with its beak, asking to be salt-kissed. You oblige, ridiculous and content, pressing a finger's worth of salt to its brow. The bird shakes itself and leaves two perfect crumbs on the sill, like little moons. Down in the lane, a knot loaf rolls end over end until it finds a child who laughs, and the laugh folds itself into your quilt. These are dream tricks, unsurprising as a cat choosing the warmest spot in any room. A fringe thought steals through something you heard from a traveler who swore by the backside of truth that sleeping with a bread heel under your pillow tethers your dreams so they will not wander into fields they cannot return from. You have never done it. Tonight you would not change what the dream has given you. Warm benches becoming roads, mills that hum like friendly throats, birds that wear cloves for eyes and approve of your manners. Another tidbit, less friendly, rises from memory. A woman in a far parish who set a cold iron knife on a loaf at bedtime to pin it to its place. The iron may have pinned nothing. The story pinned her fear long enough to sleep. Near dawn, the dream thins. The bright lace on the room's edges folds itself into gray. The heron bows its long neck and becomes again a hook for hanging aprons. You wake without a jolt. You surface like a hand rising from water to touch air. The cat's weight is exactly where you left it. The rushlight is a stub. The house is held together through the night. You listen to the quiet and do not hear your own heart racing. This is a good sign. You rise and cross to the bench. The cloth lies obediently over the loaf. Beneath it, the crust feels cool and untroubled. You cut a narrow slice and sniff. The smell is ordinary and good. You chew, attentive. The taste keeps faith with yesterday. You nod in a way that belongs to mornings. A small relief walks your shoulders back into their daytime shape. It occurs to you that perhaps the dream's brightness borrowed only from talk at the well, and the memory your hands carry of reed mats and oven songs. Perhaps the loaf is blameless, and the mind was only being its busy, generous self. Or perhaps the loaf held a thimble of mischief and tipped it out in the gentlest way possible, rubbing a little silver on the edges of things and then falling back into silence before dawn. You cannot know, and you do not need to. You will still sort this evening. You will still smell the sacks. You will still bury what looks like claws. Before you open the door to the lane, you set the heel of last night's loaf on the sill for the house spirits of your grandmother's stories. Quirky, yes, but you like the idea of feeding what keeps hinges from arguing. The heel will be gone by noon, taken by a bird or a child or a dog that lawyers would call innocent. You wash your face in the basin, press the cold into your eyelids, and come back to the bread you trust. The first true light of morning enters and touches the bench. It looks like blessing because the room has practiced receiving it for years. You step into the day carrying 2 slices in a cloth, and the quiet knowledge that you slept and woke without fire in your fingers. The world outside is the right size again. You will tell no one about the heron with the peel unless someone asks for a story, and even then, you will keep the best part to yourself. The moment the loaf's soft clicking cooling's last word found your ear in sleep and sounded exactly like the promise you make to yourself each night, and kept. Cold has a sound. It speaks in the tiny crack of frost on the lintel, and in the way your breath chooses to become visible before it becomes necessary. You lift the bar on the granary door, and it answers with a dry creak, polite as an old hinge that knows its job in winter is to remember summer. The air inside is sharper than the lane, clean, thin, trimmed down to the essentials. Dried herbs hang in bundles from a crossbeam, rosemary, tansy, a stubborn braid of garlic casting a faint green bitter scent that keeps the room from smelling only of wood and dust. The floor is high on stone piers, its boards colder than coins. You step lightly, feeling the grain of the planks through your soles even with boots on. The great bins along the wall are lidded and weighted. Their edges wear a lace of hoarfrost, where your breath lingers and then thinks better of it. A narrow window slit gives the room a line of weak silver. You set your basket on a peg and stand still until the quiet becomes company. The slow settling of kernels, the tiny chitter of a swallow awake in the eaves, the almost musical hush of wind drawing a thread through the vents. You lift the nearest lid and lean in. Winter grain keeps its secrets better than autumn grain. The top layer looks dull in the low light, each kernel tight-skinned and small with the cold. When you scoop a handful and let it fall, the sound is different than in summer, drier, yes, but also higher. The patter of sand across a drumhead stretched tight by frost. Good grain in winter still flows. Bad grain clumps where it should not, a little sullen in the palm. You test by habit. Rub a pinch until the husk warms and wakes its smell. Clean rye in winter smells like an old straw hat that remembers heat. If it smells like a seller's pocket, you note the bin, make a mark, and plan patience. It is an ordinary fact that granaries and tithe barns earn their keep most visibly in months like this. Raised floors, breathing slits, thick walls, these are the village's insulation against hunger. The Lord's due sits measured in one corner, the parish store in another. Household bins hold the rest. People borrow from tomorrow by borrowing from the store and pay back when weather relents. That is the quiet economy that winter recognizes. Grain turned into time. Time turned into survival. You walk the aisle and check the cords at each sack throat. Some are newly tied, a twisted loop and a square knot. A language fingers speak better than tongues. You tip one sack and catch it stream in a sieve held over a basin. Dark flecks reveal themselves quickly in the pale of frostlight. Shriveled claws of last season's worry. A few, not many. You pluck them from the mesh and drop them into a small bowl with a sound that is more idea than noise. You will bury them under the hedge when the ground is soft enough to permit it, or feed the safer-looking fragments to the hens if a neighbor with better judgment agrees. A small broom leans in, the corner bundle of birch twigs bound to a handle by red thread. Quirky habit says the binding must be red to discourage the kind of luck that walks on 6 legs. Whether insects care for dye is doubtful. The sight of red in winter pleases the eye, and the hand remembers to sweep. You use it to brush the board edges and the spaces between planks where chaff collects. The chaff smells faintly sweet, like a memory of threshing floors in sunlight, and for a moment the room grows warmer by nothing but association. From beneath the lid you lift a wooden paddle and stir the top few handbreadths of grain. In winter, stillness can form a skin just as surely as soup left too long by the fire. Stirring prevents that faint crust from becoming a place where damp might fancy staying. You listen while you stir. Winter grain speaks in a whispering that is nearly a purr when it's content. If the sound grows dull and heavy, you mark the bin for another look at midday, when the sun offers the illusion of warmth through the slit. Historians still argue how evenly the tricks of winter keeping were known, whether most villages had the practice of turning, testing, venting, and raising floors, or whether such carefulness belonged mostly to better-built barns and prosperous parishes. Some ledgers note repairs to vents and payments to watchmen who kept the store's keys. Others are silent, leaving you to imagine families managing with common sense and a cracked door. The evidence arrives like winter light, thin, directional, telling more about where it falls than about the whole room. You pause at the ledger shelf. A tally stick lies there with notches for each measure taken since the first frost. You run a thumb over the cuts. They are clean, the edges crisp, the story simple. So many bushels out, so many promised in spring. You add your small mark for today, a promise to return what survival borrows. Beside the stick sits a pouch of mint leaves, dried to a gray-green whisper. A neighbor swears a pinch scattered atop a bin persuades mice to keep moving. Perhaps the mice dislike mint. Perhaps the neighbor enjoys feeling helpful. You sprinkle a little anyway. The air improves. On the far wall, somebody has chalked a row of dates and a set of tidy symbols. Circle for clear, slash for snow, cross for days the river smoked. You add today's small circle, then hesitate, and draw a dot inside it for the fine ice that patterned the lane at dawn. Quirky meteorology keeps winter honest and gives the hand a reason to put resolute marks on something when the world offers nothing but soft white and hard gray. You open the smallest bin, the one you keep for mixing, and lift a scoop of barley to blend with the rye. Winter loaves like company. Pure rye bakes true. But in deep cold, the crumb benefits from a little barley's mildness. You pour the barley into the rye and fold the top layer together with the paddle. The two colors meet and make a quiet pattern, then forget which was which. You taste a kernel of each, a fool's habit perhaps, but it keeps the tongue in the conversation. The barley is almost sweet. The rye answers with a shadow that tastes like brown. At the door, you draw the bolt and crack it wide enough to refresh the room's breath. Cold climbs your sleeve at once and settles in your bones as if to remind you who is housemaster. You let the air pass through, count to 30 in the patient way of someone who has made peace with number, and close it again. A swallow rustles overhead, offended by the draft. You apologize out loud to a bird that will forget your voice by noon. You kneel to check beneath the bins. Straw lies there in a mat no thicker than your hand, dry, orderly, changed out when the moon did what an old woman said it should. The old woman believed in timing straw to the moon's shy growth and thinning. Whether rodents respect lunar calendars is uncertain. What is sure is that fresh straw in winter buys you a better smell and a cleaner conscience. You pull out a fistful, rub it between your palms for the feel and the sound, then tuck it back with the neatness that winter asks. You take your basket down and fill a small sack, enough for 2 days baking if the weather holds and the oven's mouth behaves. The sack feels denser than its size should permit. Winter adds gravity to everything: buckets, bread, even time. You tie the throat and carry it to the door, then return for one more glance at each lid, each vent, each knot. Winter rehearses forgetting. You practice remembering. Before you go, you lay your palm flat on a bin lid and hold it there until the wood stops feeling like a stranger. The granary has a pulse of its own, slower than a house, steadier than a tavern, older than a market stall. It is the room that keeps promises you hope never to make aloud. You look up at the herbs and think how thin a line sits between charm and practice. How much of winter's safety is the kind no one sings about. Knots checked twice, skins stirred, mint scattered, ledgers notched, doors cracked long enough to trade a little warmth for a little certainty. The ordinary fact remains: bread still begins here, even when nothing smells like baking. The quirky bits, red thread brooms, moontime straw, mint on bins, are the embroidery people add to plain cloth, because plain cloth has to be worn every day. And the uncertainty remains too. Whether this room's care will be enough if a season turned sly months ago and left its signature on 100 hidden grains. Historians still argue how often winter stores themselves became the unwitting authors of trouble, whether cold slowed mischief or merely tucked it in tighter. You hold both possibilities the way you hold the sack firmly, without drama, with a plan to check again tomorrow. You shoulder the grain and step out into air that bites gently and then forgives. The door settles behind you with a dull thud, and the scent of herbs follows, a green echo in a white morning. Frost squeaks under your boots. Somewhere a bell tries the hour and decides it is too early to commit. You turn toward the bakery with the sense that what is ordinary can be holy when winter is watching. A tied knot, a stirred skin, a lid replaced with the grain's quiet approval. At the lane's bend you look back once. The granary holds its shape against the sky with the calm of a full chest. You nod to it, as to an elder who prefers nods to words, and carry your small winter proof toward the mouth of an oven that will translate it into the kind of warmth a room can eat. You lift the cloth from the last loaf of the week and find its crust turn the deeper brown that days bring. The round sits smaller than when it cooled on the reeds, as if it has learned modesty with time. When you press a finger to the side, it pushes back with a steadiness that fresh bread does not bother to learn. You set it on the board and listen for a moment to the small hollowness inside still there, only quieter. The knife's first touch raises a fine dust of flour that smells faintly of cupboard and warm stone remembered. The blade works harder now. Where fresh bread parts with a sigh, this one yields with a deeper, huskier sound, crumb tight and dark beneath the crust. The slice falls away in a clean face, speckled with bran, moist in a way that belongs more to keeping than to steam. You hold it under your nose. The scent is honest and simple grain, a whisper of sourness that keeps company with rye by choice, though you can taste last Sunday tucked into it. The oven's breath reduced to an ember, not a flame. A heel for the pot would be the easy thing. You set it aside for later, to thicken a broth or soften an ale until it remembers tenderness. The rest you cut into slabs that will take well to heat. Last loaves often meet the pan. A little toasting rallies them, sharpens their courage, and sets them ready for a week's ending that admits no extravagance. This is the ordinary fact. People save the older bread for sops, trenchers, and stews, letting it be a plate first and a mouthful second. In many kitchens, the oldest rounds become twice-baked cut, dried near the oven door, kept as rusks that shrug at damp seasons and pretend to be immortal. You warm a small iron on the hearthstones and lay 2 slices upon it. The crust softens first, then the faces take on a deeper shade. A scent rises that feels older than the loaf itself, nutty, a little sweet, a cousin of roasting. You turn the slices with the tip of your knife and hear the thin, crisp whisper that signals readiness. When you bite, the crumb has learned new lessons. Firm at the edge, giving at the middle, the sour note settled into something rounder. You spread a breath of soft cheese across one and leave the other plain, as if testing 2 moods in a single tongue. Across the board lies a small pile of salt, and beside it the pot with last night's broth. You make sops the way you were taught, toast lowered into the liquid long enough to shine, not long enough to surrender. The crusts drink politely and keep their spines. You lay each on the plate and see how the broth drew a darker square where it sat. The cat assumes this is her portion, and she is not entirely wrong. You pinch off a corner and offer it. She accepts with offended dignity, the only way cats know how to be grateful. You cut deeper into the round and notice where the crumb tightens toward the center. Older loaves hold themselves a little more sternly there. A friend once said the heart of a week-old loaf is the map of its baking, and you find you believe it. A faint ring where steam lingered on the first morning, a tiny tunnel here or there where a bubble insisted on its own room, a darker seam where the score guided the rise. You touch the cut face with 2 fingers and read it as if it were a page that explains itself only to hands. A household habit purchased nearby. When the last loaf is cut, someone lays the knife across it lengthwise for the first minute, to remind it to be gentle. Your grandmother said, "You cannot say whether the gesture works or why it pleases you." It lives with other small rules. On the same shelf, don't leave bread upside down unless you mean to invite argument. Turn the heel toward the door to persuade guests to appear. Cross the first slice to thank the field. Quirky comforts, half prayer and half tidiness, and all easier to keep than ignore. You think of the oven, now cold as a closed eye, and of the way the village bakes in rhythms that vary with season, fuel, and patience. Historians still argue whether most small places lit the great mouth only once or twice a week and planned meals accordingly, or whether household hearths carried a daily smaller fire for flatter loaves that never troubled the communal stones. Records show fines for bakers who mismeasured or underbaked. They speak less clearly about how often dough met heat, In some years, wood dictates the answer. In others, daylight does. Your kitchen has learned to be grateful for either. When last loaves are good, they taste like reliability. When they are not, they tell on the week on a damp cellar day, a hurried mill hour, a sack from the river strip that should have taken the long road to porridge instead of the short walk to the peel. You bite again and listen to your tongue. The crumb sits honest. No stray bitterness pushes forward. No prickling comes to fingers or feet. You breathe out the little caution you carry every time the knife meets a round that has seen 3 or 4 dawns. Still, you remember what the miller said yesterday. Trouble, if it enters in the field, does not always leave by resting on a shelf. Time can tame dryness and day-old chew. It cannot teach certain small poisons manners. That thought arrives and then, like an ill-mannered guest faced with a steady stare, decides not to stay. The loaf in your hand has already voted for calmer weather. You keep to that vote. You set 2 slices aside for the noon pot, which promises to pretend to be a feast if given enough onion. Another you cut into fingers for the child who insists that dipping bread is a craft that adults do not understand. A fourth you break into crumbs that will coat tomorrow's fish, if the fish decide to be caught. Last loaves teach thrift better than sermons do. They invite invention without scolding. The board collects its usual small snowfall of crust, dust, and bran specks. You sweep them into your palm and feed them to the fire in a pinch, the way you always do. The flames catch at the offering and then forget it, which is precisely the point. You wrap the remainder of the round in its cloth and hold it a moment longer than necessary, weighing the future breakfast against the open door of a neighbor who might have less than you do today. The round is not grand, not soft, not new. It is exactly the sort of gift that passes between kitchens with the most gratitude. A plain fact walks in with the smell of the week's end. Bread is a store of days. Flour remembers the field and milling. Dough remembers the table and the hand. The loaf remembers the oven and the air. The last slices remember all of it and ask to be used with a little wit. In some places, they carry a gravy. In others, a bit of honey. In many, they become the plate itself, the trencher at feasts. Later fed to dogs or the poor or to the geese who learn to expect festivals by the taste of the plates. You reach for one of your older trenchers on the hook and feel where knives have written their own script across its face. You sit and eat the last warm bite from the iron. The room is ordinary in a way that feels earned. The cat settles into a curl shaped exactly like a question mark that does not expect an answer. The light through the small window dulls to a pewter calm. You think because these thoughts attach themselves to last loaves that kitchens have always made these small treaties with time. We will keep you dry, and you will keep us fed. We will sit with you when you grow stern, and you will soften again when the pot remembers you. Historians still argue whether people believed older bread was safer than new, or the reverse, whether the extra day was thought to smooth out any stray sharpness, or whether hot bread and ill bread overlapped in minds and stories until no one was sure which to fear most. You have heard both counsels shouted across tables at fairs by people who claim to remember a year when one rule or the other saved the household. Neither argument calls to you today. Your last loaf behaves. The weak circle closes without bright edges or burning hands. That is enough proof for a small kitchen with a cat and a pot. You clean the knife with a cloth dampened with a breath of ale, the way your aunt taught you, and set it where the morning will find it without rummaging. The cloth goes back over the round. The iron, still warm, keeps its spot like a faithful dog. You run a hand across the board to be sure you did not leave a crumb that will tempt mice to remember your address. Then you open the door and let the cool air finish what the iron began. The slice on your tongue reminding you that age in a loaf can be a kindness when treated kindly in return. You carry 2 fingers of toast to a neighbor and tuck them into her hand before she can protest. They steam in the chill, and her face relaxes. On your way back, you think how easily a week is counted in bread. The warm round, the cooling bench, the comfortable middle days, the stern slice, the rusk. Tomorrow the oven will wake again, and today's dark, dense truth will step aside for a new pale promise. For now, the last loaf does what last loaves are meant to do, hold the line without complaint. taste of field and patience, and give the day its quiet, sensible finish. You sit on the low stool by the oven after the last embers have been raked to the side. The mouth is dark now, the lips still warm enough to accept a palm and teach it patience. Stones that spoke in heat all day have gone quiet, except for the faintest ticking cooling's final grammar. The room holds the memory of steam without the steam itself, and the smell that remains is the shy aftertaste of crust, ash, and hard work. You lean your shoulder against the wall and feel a heat that pretends it is not already decided to leave. The peel rests where it always rests, handle slanting like a staff leaned beside a door. A brush of rye straw lies across it, a loose bundle that looks ceremonial even though it is only a tool's companion. You think of the first loaf of morning, the last loaf before dusk, and all the in-betweens that made the day polite. You think of the baskets that came and went, the hands that paid, and the mouths that did the true accounting. The cat, who believes ovens exist for its bones, steals your warm spot whenever you stand, and returns it grudgingly when you sit again. You allow this bargain because it keeps the evening occupied. The oven is a simple truth. In villages and towns, brick and clay domes like this have been the heart of kitchens and bakehouses for centuries, fed with faggots and billets, heated, swept, and then used while the stones remembered fire well enough to bake many rounds on a single burning. That is the mainstream fact. Easy to say and easier to smell. Yet no two ovens behave alike. This one holds heat in its left cheek a little longer than its right. That one across the square prefers to scorch the first row and forgive the last. Historians still argue whether these quirks were recorded and taught passed from master to apprentice as rules, or whether every baker made peace with whatever temperament the clay chose as soon as it dried. You watch your breath and the oven's breath make the same small cloud near the mouth, both of them thinner now that night is truly here. The stones change color when the fire sleeps. The dome models in ash-pale islands. The floor deepens to a flat brown that tells you not to trust it with your palm just yet. You slide the brush across once more, not to clean anything, only to give your hands a reason to move. The straw makes its crisp whisper. A few powdery flecks drift up, glitter briefly, disappear. On a shelf you keep a small dish of salt and a sprig of rosemary beside a corked jar of water. The dish is for a pinch tossed into the mouth when the first firing of the week begins. A habit you learned from someone who never explained it beyond. Ovens like to be greeted. The rosemary is for fanning flies in summer, and for pretending that rooms behave better when they smell like gardens. The jar of water is for a last-minute flick when a crust wants help finding its rise. Quirky as they seem lined up there, the three together look like a tiny altar to patience. You nod at them without mockery. You think of the sacks marked with a chalk X that did not meet this mouth today, and of the shallow graves along the hedge where small purple-brown shards sleep out of reach of pot and pan. You think of lamplight hours and sieve hours, of the miller's thumb on a kernel, of the whisper from the river mill's wheel that spoke through your souls even when you weren't listening. You do a day's arithmetic without numbers. How many careful gestures stood between field and table? How many small refusals? How many quiet rescues no one will ever count? A neighbor passes the open door and calls a good evening that means more than it says. You raise a hand and ask after her store. She answers with a tilt of the chin that says the winter will allow itself to be crossed if people keep their hands busy. There is a comfort in such exchanges, a rhythm smoother than talk. The oven keeps its counsel, as ovens do, letting people speak near it without ever joining the sentence. You set your ear near the mouth and listen for the little crackle that says stones settling. Some bakers call it the oven's sleep talk. Others swear they can hear the day's loaves answering a faint echo of crusts that remembered how to murmur even off the reed mats. You will not claim you hear either one clearly. You hear the suggestion of both and find the suggestion sufficient. Historians still argue whether such listening began as a guild trick, a way to teach attention to heat, or whether it arrived everywhere at once because human ears are easily teased by friendly noises at day's end. Either origin suits you. The apprentices will bank the coals for morning, shut the shutter to half, and lean the brush and peel just so. You consider the order of those gestures as if each were a bead to touch in prayer. Rake, brush, door, wedge, shudder, sweep, nod. You add one more, your own habit, to stroke the oven's lip with 2 fingers, as if you were smoothing a child's brow. The stones do not notice, but you do, and that is enough for a small rite that taxes no one. From the far back of the room, the cooling boards give off a faint wooden sweetness as the day's last warmth leaves them. The patterned reeds stand rolled in the corner like bundled mats of summer air. You unroll one to be sure it lies flat for morning, then roll it again and lean it back, the way you have seen it done since hands older than yours owned the job. In the sweepings pan, a handful of flour looks like winter's breath, gathered into a small drift. You consider scattering it at the door, then remember that mice also like drifts, and think better of your poetry. You remember, because night invites remembering, the year when rain wrote its long sentence across harvest, and people spoke of Saint's fire more than they spoke of feasts. You were younger then. The oven was less patient, and you were more so. Bread left this mouth that warmed bellies and woke hands with cramps. That winter taught a cold respect and a catalog of small deeds. Longer sorting, slower milling, sacks opened twice, thrice, and again. Loaves tasted first at this very stool, and sometimes thrown whole to pigs who did not mind the season's mischief. The pigs thrived, the village endured. The oven's lip grew no kinder or crueler. It stayed itself while people learned their work more precisely. A moth tests the rushlight and thinks better of it. The cat offers a yawn so wide it shows a bread, knife's worth of teeth, and then folds into a C that fits the peel shadow. You pull the wedge from the oven door and set the door not quite shut enough of a crack to let the last threads wander away, not enough to invite a draft that steals too much. The room's temperature drops the width of a thought. You rub your arms and then smile at your own theatrics. You leave a heel on the sill for whoever keeps kitchens honest, be that spirits, mice, or children who claim to be only passing by. You tuck the knife into its place on the beam with the blade turned inward, a promise you made to a grandmother that her warnings might rest. You tie the rosemary tighter and wet the cloth that will meet the floor at dawn. These are old motions. They have no need to be justified. At last you stand, place both hands on the oven's shoulder, and let the last heat teach your palms the size of your day. The stones let go of you without reluctance. You thank them the thanks, a breath, not a word, and step into the lane where cold gathers in the playful way of cats at corners. Over the roofs, the sky carries neither omen nor story, only its usual dark, steady, and without edges. You close the door on the oven's quiet and carry the day's ordinary miracle with you. Grain that did not misbehave, bread that behaved exactly enough, hands that remembered their work, and an evening that ends with warmth fading at the expected pace. If there is a lesson, it is the kind that never tries to be loud. Ovens forget. People remember. Between the two, a village sleeps without bright edges on its walls. The room grows softer as the oven's warmth slips into the background. You sit a little farther from the mouth now, letting the cooler air gather around your shoulders like a plain cloak. Outside, the lane has traded voices for footprints. The last cart has already chosen its stall. A reed mat leans where you left it. Its woven lines, a quiet pattern your eyes follow without needing to arrive anywhere. You breathe as slowly as the embers dim. Your hands remember the weight of dough without asking for it again. Your ears remember the little clicks of cooling crust, and then let even those become part of the hush. The cat resettles and becomes a small stone with fur. A grain of flour that missed its purpose rests on the table, making a moon no one will name. Imagine the scent in the room thinning by degrees, from bread to warm board, from warm board to clean straw, from clean straw to nothing at all. The bench accepts the darkness. The peel looks taller in the shadow and then, kindly, looks like only wood again. You blink more slowly. The rushlight lowers itself to a stub. The stub learns to be smoke. The smoke learns to be a memory you might not bother to keep. There is no task left tonight. You folded the cloth, tied the sprig, set the door. The oven is not waiting for you. It is asleep. The stones are not counting on you. They have forgotten for now. You let your shoulders do the same. You do not rehearse tomorrow. You do not lift a sack. You keep no tally. You have earned a room without lists. Let the breath smooth. Let the eyes half close. The floor holds your steps without asking for any more. In the plain dark, The day becomes a single calm loaf. Finished, cooling, silent, good. End of script. Sweet dreams.